There are moments in life when the weight of our own failure feels heavier than anything imposed upon us by the world. The condemnation we fear most often comes not from others, but from within, from the relentless voice that reminds us of what we've done, what we've said, what we've become. And in those moments when regret carves itself so deeply into our hearts that we believe redemption is impossible, we need to hear a story about a man who stood by a fire, weeping over his betrayal, only to discover that God's grace burns brighter than any shame we carry. This is the story of Peter, the apostle who denied the very person he loved most. It is a story of failure and restoration, of grief and commissioning, of a morning on the shore where everything broken was quietly made whole again. It is a story for anyone who has ever believed they disqualified themselves from purpose. Because God does not end our story at our lowest moment. He meets us there and continues it. The Sea of Galilee has witnessed countless moments of transformation throughout history. Its waters have carried fishermen through storms, provided sustenance for communities, and served as the backdrop for some of the most profound teachings ever spoken. But perhaps no moment on those shores carries more weight than the morning when a group of exhausted fishermen, their nets empty and their hearts heavy, encountered a figure on the beach who would change everything they understood about failure, forgiveness, and the relentless pursuit of grace. Chapter 1. The weight of denial. Peter had always been a man of action, bold, impulsive, the kind of person who spoke before thinking, who leapt from boats before testing the water, who swore oaths with absolute certainty even when his heart had not yet been tested. He had been the one to declare that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. He had been the one to step out onto the water when the others stayed in the boat. He had been the one to draw a sword in the garden, ready to fight an entire cohort of soldiers to defend his teacher, and he had been the one to deny him 3 times. The memory played in Peter's mind like a script he could not rewrite. The courtyard, the charcoal fire, the servant girl's question, the cold night air pressing against his skin as the warmth of the flames flickered across the faces of strangers who were watching him, waiting for his answer. He had felt the trap closing around him. Fear had risen in his chest, sharp and suffocating, and before he could stop himself the words had come out. "I do not know the man." Once, twice, 3 times. And then, across the courtyard, Jesus had turned and looked at him. Not with anger, not with accusation, just a look, a gaze that said everything without words. And Peter had remembered the warning Jesus had given him hours earlier, the prophecy he had dismissed as impossible. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. He had run, into the darkness, into the streets, away from the fire, away from the trial, away from the man he had sworn to follow unto death. And he had wept bitterly. The crucifixion that followed had been unbearable. Peter had not been there. He had hidden. He had failed not only to stand beside Jesus in his greatest need, but to even watch from a distance as the one he loved suffered and died. The guilt was a stone in his chest, pressing down with every breath. The resurrection had brought confusion and wonder to the other disciples, but for Peter, it brought something else, the unbearable weight of facing the one he had betrayed. He had seen Jesus. The tomb was empty. The risen Christ had appeared to them, spoken peace, breathed on them, commissioned them, but Peter could not shake the feeling that something between them remained unresolved. Jesus had not condemned him. He had not even mentioned the denial, and somehow that silence felt worse than any rebuke. Peter carried the shame like a cloak he could not remove. He was forgiven, perhaps, but restored? That felt impossible. In the days following the resurrection, Peter moved through the world like a man walking through fog. Everything around him had changed, and yet the landscape of his own heart remained shadowed by what he had done. The other disciples spoke of their encounters with the risen Christ with wonder and joy, their voices filled with excitement about what would come next. But Peter's joy was muted, coloured by the knowledge of his betrayal. He remembered every detail of that night, the garden where Jesus had prayed while he slept, the moment when the soldiers came and he had drawn his sword, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant, ready to fight to the death. Jesus had healed the man's ear and told Peter to put away his sword. Even then, Peter had not understood. He thought courage meant violence, loyalty meant aggression. He did not yet know that true courage would require something far more difficult, the willingness to stand and be identified when everything in him screamed to run. The courtyard had been cold. Peter could still feel the chill of that night, the way the stone walls seemed to trap the cold air and hold it close to the ground. He had followed Jesus at a distance, trying to see what would happen, trying to stay close enough to matter, but far enough away to remain safe. It was a compromise that had pleased no one, least of all himself. The first question had come from a servant girl. Just a girl, not a soldier or a priest or anyone with authority. And yet her simple question had terrified him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee. He had denied it. I don't know what you're talking about. The second time, another servant girl had pointed him out to those standing nearby. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again he denied it, this time with an oath. I do not know the man. The third time, the bystanders had confronted him directly. They had recognized his accent, the way he spoke that marked him as a Galilean, the same as Jesus. Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. And Peter had begun to invoke curses on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. The sound had cut through the night like a knife, and Jesus, being led through the courtyard, had turned and looked at him. That look! Peter had replayed it in his mind 1,000 times since then, trying to read in it condemnation or disappointment or anger. But all he could remember was sorrow, a deep, penetrating sorrow that seemed to say, I told you this would happen, and I love you still. Peter had fled into the darkness and wept until his throat was raw and his chest ached. He had failed the greatest test of his life. He had proven himself to be exactly what he always feared, a coward who spoke boldly but acted weakly when the moment came. The days that followed were a blur of grief and confusion. Jesus had been crucified. The disciples had scattered. Everything they had believed and hoped for seemed to have died on that cross. Peter had hidden with the others, door locked, hearts broken, future uncertain. And then came the resurrection. Mary Magdalene had brought the news. The tomb was empty. She had seen the risen Christ. The disciples had not believed her at first, but Peter and John had run to the tomb to see for themselves. Peter had entered the empty tomb and seen the burial cloths lying there, the face cloth folded separately. Something impossible had happened. Jesus had appeared to them, first to Mary, then to the disciples gathered in the locked room. He had shown them his hands and his side. He had breathed on them and said, Receive the Holy Spirit. He had commissioned them to go into the world and make disciples of all nations. But he had not addressed Peter's denial. Not directly. Not in a way that brought closure. Peter knew he was forgiven. Jesus had not rejected him. But forgiveness and restoration are not always the same thing. Forgiveness removes the penalty. Restoration returns the purpose. And Peter did not feel restored. He felt like a man who had been given a second chance but was not sure he deserved to take it. The weight of that uncertainty pressed on him day after day. He watched the other disciples as they spoke about their experiences with the risen Christ, their faces bright with the kind of faith that had not been tested and found wanting. And Peter wondered if he would ever feel that lightness again, or if he would carry the weight of his failure for the rest of his life. Chapter 2. Returning to the familiar. When you do not know what to do with your life, you return to what you know. For Peter, that meant the sea. The Sea of Galilee stretched out before him, vast and familiar, the same body of water he had worked since boyhood. The smell of fish and salt, the creak of wooden boats, the rhythm of casting nets and hauling them in. It was the trade he had known before Jesus called him, the life he had left behind to follow a rabbi who promised to make him a fisher of men. But now, standing on the shore with the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders, Peter wondered if that calling had been revoked, if his denial had disqualified him, if the best thing he could do now was simply return to what he had always been, a fisherman. "I am going fishing," he told the others. Several of the disciples were with him: Thomas, Nathanael, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Two others whose names history does not record but whose presence mattered nonetheless. They had all been there. They had all seen the risen Jesus. They had all received the breath of the Holy Spirit and the command to go into the world. But like Peter, they did not yet fully understand what that meant. So when Peter said he was going fishing, they simply replied, "We will go with you." They launched the boat as the sun set, the sky turning shades of amber and violet, the water calm beneath them. The work was familiar: the casting of nets, the waiting, the scanning of the water for signs of movement. For hours they laboured in the growing darkness, their muscles remembering the old rhythms, their hands knowing the motions without thought. But the sea gave them nothing. Net after net came up empty. The night stretched on, cold and quiet, and with each failed attempt the silence grew heavier. Peter worked without speaking, his mind turning over the same thoughts again and again. He had denied Jesus. He had failed. And now, even the sea, the one constant in his life, the one thing he had always been able to rely on, was failing him too. The boat rocked gently on the dark water. Around them, the night was filled with the sounds of the sea, the slap of small waves against the hull, the cry of night birds, the whisper of wind across the surface. In the distance, lights from the shore flickered like distant stars. Other fishermen were out on the water as well, their boats scattered across the darkness, each one hoping for a catch that would make the night's labour worthwhile. Peter pulled on the ropes, his hands rough and calloused from years of this work. He had done this since he was a boy, learning the trade from his father, understanding the rhythms of the sea and the habits of the fish. He knew where to cast the nets. He knew when the fish were running. He knew the signs to look for, the subtle shifts in wind and water that told a skilled fisherman where to find success. But tonight, all that knowledge seemed useless. Thomas worked beside him in silence. Thomas, who had doubted the resurrection until he saw Jesus with his own eyes, who had touched the wounds in his hands and side and declared, "My Master and my God." Even Thomas, whose faith had been tested and proven, seemed unsure of what came next. They were all in the same boat, literally and figuratively, trying to figure out what it meant to be disciples of a risen Christ, in a world that had not yet fully grasped what that meant. Nathanael hauled on another rope, his face set with concentration. James and John worked together with the practiced ease of brothers who had spent their entire lives on these waters. They had been with Jesus since the beginning. They had seen the miracles. They had heard the teachings. They had witnessed the transfiguration on the mountain. And yet, here they were, back on the sea, fishing as if nothing had changed, except everything had changed. Peter cast the net again, watching it spread wide as it sank beneath the surface. He waited, feeling the familiar tension of the ropes in his hands, anticipating the pull that would tell him the net was filling with fish. But when he drew it in, it was empty once more. The failure stung. Not just because they needed the fish to sell, not just because their families depended on their ability to provide, but because it felt like one more confirmation of what Peter already believed about himself, that he was inadequate, insufficient, unable to succeed even at the one thing he had always been good at. He thought about the day Jesus had first called him. It had been a morning much like this one, after a night of fruitless fishing. Jesus had borrowed Peter's boat to teach the crowds gathered on the shore, and when he finished he had told Peter to put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Peter had objected. They had been fishing all night and caught nothing. The conditions were wrong. It was the wrong time of day. Every instinct he had as a fisherman told him it would be useless. But something about Jesus had compelled him to obey anyway. "Master," he had said, "we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And the nets had filled so full they began to break. They had to call their partners in the other boat to help, and both boats had been so full of fish they began to sink. Peter had fallen at Jesus' knees, overwhelmed by the miracle, declaring, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, Master." But Jesus had not departed. Instead, he had said, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And Peter had left everything and followed him. Now, years later, Peter was back on the same sea, fishing again, as if that calling had never happened. As if the years with Jesus had been a dream from which he had awakened to find himself back where he started. The night wore on. The sky began to lighten imperceptibly in the east, the first hint of dawn still an hour away. They made another cast, and another, each one as fruitless as the last. Peter's arms ached, his back was sore, his hands were raw from pulling ropes, and his heart was heavy with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He was tired of failing, tired of trying, tired of carrying the weight of his own inadequacy. He looked out over the dark water and wondered if this was all his life would be from now on, working through the night, coming up empty, returning to shore with nothing to show for his effort. A man who had once walked with the Son of God, now reduced to a fisherman who could not even catch fish. The thought filled him with a despair so deep he could hardly breathe. Chapter 3. The Empty Nets. By the time the first light of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon, the disciples were exhausted. Their arms ached. Their hands were raw. The boat smelled of sweat and salt and disappointment. They had caught nothing. Peter stared at the empty nets piled in the bottom of the boat. The fisherman's instinct told him they should have found something by now. The conditions had been right. The location was good. They had done everything correctly. And yet the sea had given them nothing. It felt like a metaphor. All his effort, all his striving, and still nothing. He had returned to the familiar, hoping it would offer some comfort, some sense of identity, some way to anchor himself after everything had fallen apart. But even this, the one thing he knew how to do, had produced no result. The others were quiet. Exhaustion dulled their conversation. They moved mechanically now, preparing to make one more cast before giving up entirely and heading back to shore. The sun was rising, the night was over, and they had nothing to show for it. Peter looked out over the water, watching the light spread across the surface, turning the dark sea into shimmering silver. The world felt vast and indifferent. He felt small, useless. A man who had once walked on water but now could not even catch a fish. The memory of that moment came back to him with startling clarity. The storm, the wind, the waves, the disciples terrified in the boat while Jesus walked toward them across the water. Peter had been the one to call out, "Master, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus had said, "Come." Peter had stepped out of the boat. He had felt the water solid beneath his feet, impossible and yet real. For a few glorious steps he had walked on the surface of the sea, his eyes fixed on Jesus, his faith lifting him above the natural laws that should have pulled him down. And then he had noticed the wind, the waves, the impossibility of what he was doing, and fear had gripped him, and he had begun to sink. "Master, save me," he had cried out. And immediately Jesus had reached out his hand and caught him. "O you of little faith," he had said, "why did you doubt?" Little faith. That was Peter's defining characteristic, it seemed. Not faithlessness, but little faith. Enough to step out of the boat, but not enough to keep walking. Enough to make bold declarations, but not enough to keep those promises when the moment of testing came. Enough to follow Jesus for 3 years, but not enough to stand beside him in the courtyard. Little faith. The sky continued to brighten. The stars faded one by one, surrendering to the approaching day. The sea, which had been dark and formless in the night, now revealed its features. The gentle rolling of the waves, the distant shoreline, the other boats scattered across the water, all of them returning home with their catches, or, like Peter's boat, returning empty. John was coiling rope, his movements slow and methodical. Thomas sat with his back against the side of the boat, his eyes closed, perhaps praying, perhaps simply too tired to keep them open. Nathaniel was checking the nets for damage, making sure they were ready for the next attempt, whenever that would be. James spoke quietly to his brother, and Peter caught fragments of their conversation. Something about what they would tell their families. Something about whether they should try again tomorrow night or find some other way to provide. Something about whether they should return to Jerusalem, where the other disciples were waiting for whatever came next. Peter said nothing. He had no answers, no wisdom to offer, no leadership to provide. He was just a fisherman who could not catch fish, a disciple who had denied his master, a man who had failed at everything that mattered. The despair that had been building in him all night threatened to overwhelm him. He gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched, fighting the urge to cry out in frustration. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to move forward when every step felt like sinking? He thought about the others who had followed Jesus. Mary Magdalene, from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons, who had been the first to see him risen, who had been entrusted with the message to tell the disciples. She had not denied him. She had stood at the foot of the cross when the disciples had fled. John, the beloved disciple, who had also been at the cross, standing with Mary, the mother of Jesus, he had not denied him. The women who had provided for Jesus and the disciples out of their own means, who had come to the tomb that first Easter morning with spices to anoint his body. They had not denied him. Only Peter had done that. Peter, who had been given the keys to the kingdom. Peter, who had been called the rock on which the church would be built. Peter, who had been so certain of his own loyalty that he had declared he would go with Jesus to prison and to death. Even if all fall away, Peter had said, I will not. But he had fallen away. He had fallen farther and harder than any of them, and now here he was, on a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, unable even to perform the simple task of catching fish. The irony was not lost on him. Jesus had called him to be a fisher of men, and Peter had proven he could not even fish for fish. The sun broke over the horizon, sending golden light across the water. It should have been beautiful, should have filled Peter with hope, the way every sunrise carries the promise of a new beginning. But all Peter felt was emptiness. The light illuminated nothing but his failure. And then, from the shore, a voice called out to them. Chapter 4. A voice from the shore. The figure stood at the edge of the water, perhaps 100 yards away. In the early morning mist, his features were indistinct, just a silhouette against the brightening sky. But his voice carried clearly across the water, cutting through the morning stillness with unexpected clarity. Children, do you have any fish? The question was simple, direct, the kind of thing one fisherman might ask another. It was not unusual for people on the shore to call out to returning boats, asking about the catch, perhaps hoping to buy fresh fish. Peter and the others exchanged glances. They were tired, frustrated. The last thing they wanted was to admit their failure to a stranger on the shore. No, they called back. The figure did not move. For a moment there was only the sound of water lapping against the side of the boat, the distant cry of gulls, the soft rustle of wind over the surface of the sea. The sun continued to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, the mist beginning to burn off as the warmth of the day approached. And then the voice came again, calm and confident, with a certainty that seemed to suggest the speaker knew something they did not. Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. Peter felt something stir in his chest. The instruction was so specific, so confident, and something about the voice, something in the tone, in the certainty, felt deeply familiar. It was not just that someone was telling them where to fish, it was the way they were being told, the absolute assurance in the words, the gentle authority that did not demand but invited. Peter looked at the others. John's eyes had narrowed slightly, as if he too was trying to place something familiar in the voice. Thomas looked sceptical, but also curious. They had nothing to lose. They had been fishing all night with no success. One more cast would not hurt, even if it seemed pointless. Without discussion, they obeyed. They cast the net on the right side of the boat, letting it sink into the water, spreading wide beneath the surface. The movements were practiced, automatic. They had done this hundreds of times, thousands of times. The net settled into the water, the weights pulling it down, the floats keeping the top edge near the surface, creating a curtain of mesh that would catch anything swimming into it. For a moment, nothing happened. The boat drifted gently on the calm water. The morning was peaceful, quiet, the kind of stillness that often came just after dawn before the business of the day began. Peter held the rope loosely in his hand, not expecting anything, just going through the motions because a stranger on the shore had told them to. And then the net jerked violently, the rope straining, the boat tilting slightly as the weight pulled against them. The net was full, not just full, overflowing. So full they could not haul it into the boat. The fish thrashed and twisted, the net bulging with the weight of them, the ropes cutting into Peter's hands as he struggled to hold on. The others grabbed the ropes, pulling together, but the catch was too great. The net was too heavy. They could barely keep it from sinking. Peter pulled with all his strength, his muscles screaming, his breath coming hard. The net strained against the weight, the mesh stretching but holding. Fish roiled beneath the surface, silver scales flashing in the morning light. So many fish it seemed impossible, miraculous. And then, beside him, John spoke quietly, his voice filled with wonder and recognition. "It is the Master." The words hit Peter like lightning. Everything inside him suddenly made sense. The voice from the shore, the specific instruction, the impossible catch, the exact echo of the moment years ago when Jesus had first called him. It is the Master. Chapter 5. Recognition. Peter turned and looked toward the shore, and in that instant he knew. The figure standing at the edge of the water was not a stranger. It was Jesus. Peter did not think. He did not calculate. He did not weigh his options or consider the best course of action. He simply acted. Grabbing his outer garment, the kind fishermen shed while working because it got in the way, he wrapped it around himself, an instinctive gesture of modesty and respect, and threw himself into the water. The cold shock of it hit him all at once, but he did not care. The water closed over his head for a moment before he surfaced, gasping, his arms moving in powerful strokes. He waded and swam and stumbled toward the shore, his eyes fixed on the figure waiting for him, his heart pounding with something he could not name. Was it fear, hope, desperation, love? All of them together, a tangled mass of emotion that propelled him forward through the water with singular focus. Behind him, the other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. The distance to shore was not far, perhaps 100 yards, but for Peter, every stroke through the water felt like a journey. He was moving toward the one he had denied, the one he had failed, the one who had every right to turn away from him, and yet was standing there, waiting. Peter's feet found the shallow water, and he stood, water streaming from his clothes, his breath coming in heaving gasps. He waded the last few steps and stood on the beach, dripping and breathless, his eyes meeting those of Jesus. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Peter stood there uncertain, his heart racing, his mind flooding with everything he wanted to say and could not find words for. "I am sorry. I failed you. I denied you. I am not worthy. I do not deserve to stand here. Please forgive me. Please do not send me away." But before Peter could speak, Jesus looked at him with a gaze that held no condemnation, no anger, no disappointment, just presence, just love, just welcome. "Come," Jesus said simply, his voice gentle. "Have breakfast." The words were so ordinary, so domestic, so utterly without drama or accusation. Come have breakfast, as if nothing had happened, as if Peter had not denied him, as if they were simply friends gathering for a meal on the shore of the sea. Peter felt something break loose in his chest. Not the breaking of despair, but the breaking of the walls he had built around his heart to contain his shame. Jesus was inviting him to breakfast. After everything, after the denial, after the failure, after the days of guilt and self-condemnation, Jesus was inviting him to come and eat. Chapter 6. The fire that mirrors the past. Peter saw the fire first. A charcoal fire burning low and steady on the beach. Fish already cooking on it, the smell savoury and comforting. Bread laid out nearby, warm and fresh. The smell of wood smoke and grilled fish filled the air, warm and inviting. But for Peter, the sight of that fire sent a jolt of recognition straight through his chest. A charcoal fire. The last time he had stood beside a charcoal fire, it had been in the courtyard of the high priest. The night of Jesus' trial. The night Peter denied him 3 times. The warmth of the flames on his face. The cold of the night pressing in. The questions, the accusations, the fear, the denials. And now, here was another charcoal fire, on a quiet beach, in the early morning light, prepared by the very man Peter had denied. The parallel was unmistakable. Jesus had not chosen this by accident. The charcoal fire was intentional. He was creating a moment that would mirror the past but transform it. The same setting, the same element. But instead of denial, there would be restoration. Instead of fear, there would be love. Instead of running away, they would be coming home. The other disciples pulled the boat onto the shore, dragging the net full of fish behind them. The net was so heavy with the catch that it took all of them working together to bring it in. Jesus told them to bring some of the fish they had caught, and they counted them, 153 large fish. And yet, remarkably, the net had not torn despite the weight. 153. The specific number would be remembered and recorded, a detail that spoke to the precision of the moment, the reality of the miracle. This was not a vague story or an exaggerated tale. This was something that happened, something witnessed, something that could be testified to with exact details. Jesus invited them to sit, to eat. He served them bread and fish, taking the bread and giving it to them, and likewise the fish. His movements were gentle, unhurried. There was no urgency, no tension, just a meal shared among friends on the shore of the sea as the sun rose and the day began. They ate together in the quiet of the morning. No one asked Jesus if it was really him. They knew. There was no need for confirmation or proof. His presence was unmistakable. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he served them. This was their master, risen from the dead, preparing breakfast for them on the beach. Peter ate in silence, the warmth of the fire beside him, the taste of the fish on his tongue, and the memory of another fire pressing on his mind. Every bite was a contradiction. The comfort of the present moment warring with the pain of the past. The grace of Jesus serving him breakfast after Peter had denied him. The impossibility of sitting here, eating and being welcomed, when Peter felt he should be banished, rejected, cast out. But Jesus had not cast him out. Jesus had called him to come, had invited him to eat, had served him with his own hands. The fire crackled softly. The waves whispered against the shore. The other disciples ate quietly, sensing that something significant was happening, something beyond the meal, something that the morning was building toward. And when the meal was finished, Jesus turned to Peter. The others were nearby, but this moment was between the two of them. The fire burned low beside them, the embers glowing, the smoke rising gently into the morning air. And Jesus spoke Peter's given name, the name he had been born with, the name that represented who he was before Jesus had renamed him. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Chapter 7. The 3 questions. The question landed gently, but Peter felt its weight. Simon, son of John. Not Peter, the name Jesus had given him, meaning rock, but Simon, his birth name, the name that represented the man he had been before he followed Jesus, the man who was a fisherman, the man who was impulsive and fearful and fallible. Do you love me more than these? More than these. The words could mean several things. More than these other disciples love me. More than you love these fish, this boat, this life you have returned to. More than you love yourself and your own safety and your own comfort. Peter had once declared that even if all the others fell away, he would not. He had compared his loyalty to theirs and found his own superior. He had been so confident, so certain, so wrong. Now, he didn't compare himself to anyone. He did not make bold declarations. He simply answered from his heart, acknowledging the one thing he knew to be true despite all his failures. Yes, Master, you know that I love you. The Greek word Peter used for love was different from the one Jesus had used. Jesus had asked about agape, the highest form of love, self-sacrificing and unconditional. Peter responded with phileo, brotherly love, affection, friendship. It was as if Peter was saying, I cannot claim the kind of love that never fails, the kind I thought I had and proved I did not. But I can tell you that I am fond of you, that I care for you, that my love for you, however imperfect, is real. Jesus looked at him, and there was no skepticism in his gaze, only invitation, only purpose, only the next step forward. Feed my lambs. A commission, a task, a calling. Jesus was entrusting Peter with the care of his followers, the ones who are young in faith, the ones who needed to be fed with truth and guidance. Despite the denial, despite the failure, Jesus was giving Peter responsibility. A pause. The fire crackled. The waves continued their rhythm. The morning grew brighter around them, and then Jesus asked again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Again the question, the same question, and Peter felt something tighten in his chest. He had denied Jesus 3 times, and now Jesus was asking him 3 times. This was not coincidence, this was intentional. Jesus was creating an opportunity for Peter to affirm his love the same number of times he had denied it, not to condemn, but to restore. Yes, Master, Peter said, his voice quieter now, more earnest. You know that I love you. Again he used phileo. Again he did not claim more than he felt he could honestly offer. His confidence was gone, replaced by humble honesty. He could not promise perfect love, but he could offer true love, however imperfect. Jesus nodded, accepting the answer without qualification. Tend my sheep. A second commission. Not just feeding the young ones, but tending the flock, caring for them, watching over them, guiding them, protecting them. Jesus was expanding Peter's responsibility, showing him that his role was not diminished by his failure, but was being affirmed and deepened. The 3rd time Jesus asked again, and this time Peter felt the grief rise in his throat. The memory of the courtyard, the charcoal fire, the denials, the rooster's crow, the look Jesus had given him. 3 times Peter had said, I do not know the man. And now, 3 times Jesus was asking, Do you love me? Peter was grieved that Jesus asked him the 3rd time, not because he doubted Jesus' reasons, but because the repetition forced him to confront fully the weight of what he had done. Each question was a reminder. Each answer was a confession. Each moment was an opportunity to replace a denial with an affirmation. Master, Peter said, his voice breaking, emotion flooding through him, you know everything. You know that I love you. It was a cry from the heart, an appeal to the one who sees all, knows all, understands all. Peter could not prove his love. He could only offer it, and he appealed to Jesus' perfect knowledge, to the fact that Jesus could see into Peter's heart and know the truth, even when Peter's actions had contradicted it. Jesus looked at him with a gaze full of compassion and purpose, a gaze that saw Peter fully, his failures and his faithfulness, his weakness and his love, and accepted all of it. Feed my sheep. 3 denials, 3 affirmations, 3 commissions. The past was not erased. The denials had happened. They were part of Peter's story, part of who he was, but they were no longer a barrier. They were no longer the defining moment of his life. Jesus was showing Peter that failure does not disqualify us from purpose, that God's calling is not revoked by our weakness, that restoration is not only possible, but is offered freely to those who will receive it. Peter sat beside the fire, the same kind of fire where he had denied Jesus, and felt something shift deep within him. The shame was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The regret was still there, but it no longer defined him. He had failed, yes, but he was loved, and he was called. Jesus continued speaking, his words both sobering and empowering, painting a picture of Peter's future that was both glorious and difficult. Truly, truly I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Peter understood. Jesus was telling him that following him would not lead to comfort or safety. It would lead to sacrifice, to suffering, to a death that Peter would not choose for himself. The freedom of youth would give way to the constraints of age and the surrender of martyrdom. But Jesus was also telling him something else, that Peter's life still had purpose, that his calling was not revoked, that his failure had not ended his story. Jesus looked at him and said simply, with the same words he had spoken years ago on this very shore, "Follow me," the same invitation, the same call. But now Peter understood it differently. He had failed, he had been broken, he had denied the one he loved, and still Jesus was calling him to follow, not because Peter was strong, not because Peter was perfect, but because God's purpose does not depend on our flawlessness. It depends on our willingness to rise again after we fall. It depends on our willingness to say yes, even when we know we might fail again. It depends on grace, which covers our weakness and transforms it into testimony. Chapter 8. The commission restored. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the shore in golden light. The Sea of Galilee stretched out before them, calm and beautiful, its surface reflecting the sky like polished glass. The boat rested on the beach, the net full of fish beside it. The fire burned low, the coals glowing red beneath the grey ash, and Peter sat there, no longer weighed down by the crushing burden of his failure, but lifted up by the grace of the one who had called him. "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep." The words echoed in Peter's mind, not as a burden, but as a gift. Jesus was entrusting him with the care of his people, the ones Jesus loved most, the ones he had died for, the ones he had risen to save, and Jesus was placing them into Peter's hands, commissioning him to shepherd them, to guide them, to feed them with the truth. It was an extraordinary act of trust. Peter, the denier, was being called to be a shepherd. Peter, who had run away, was being called to lead others. Peter, who had failed the greatest test of his life, was being called to strengthen his brothers. This was the mystery of grace. God does not wait for us to be perfect before he uses us. He does not demand that we prove ourselves worthy before he calls us. He meets us in our brokenness and says, "I can work with this. I can use you, not despite your failure, but through it. Your weakness will become your testimony. Your brokenness will become your message. You will feed my sheep because you know what it is to be hungry. You will tend them because you know what it is to wander. You will lead them because you know what it is to be lost and found." Peter had spent days believing he was disqualified. He had carried the weight of his denial like a chain around his neck, convinced that his moment of weakness had ended his usefulness to God. But here, beside the fire, Jesus was showing him a different truth, that restoration is possible, that failure is not final, that God does not abandon those who stumble. The commission Jesus gave Peter was not a test to prove he was worthy. It was a declaration that he was loved and chosen, not because he had earned it, but because God's grace is greater than our failure. The calling had not been revoked. It had been reaffirmed, clarified, strengthened. Peter thought about the days ahead, the work that would need to be done, the church that would need to be built, the the message that would need to be preached, the persecution that would come, the sacrifice that would be required. It would not be easy. Jesus had made that clear. Following him meant walking a path that led to suffering, to rejection, to death. But Peter was ready now in a way he had not been before. Not because he was stronger or braver or more faithful, but because he had been broken and remade. He had seen his own weakness face to face, and he had learned that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. He had failed, and he had been restored. And that experience of falling and being lifted up, of denying and being forgiven, of running away and being welcomed back, would become the foundation of his ministry. He would preach with the authority of someone who knew grace personally. He would lead with the humility of someone who had failed. He would shepherd others with the compassion of someone who had been shepherded through his own darkest moment. The fire burned low beside them. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The day was beginning, and with it, the rest of Peter's life. A life that would be marked not by his perfection, but by his willingness to follow Jesus even after failing him. A life that would testify not to human strength, but to divine grace. Jesus stood, indicating that the moment was complete. The restoration had been accomplished. The commission had been given. The past had been addressed and transformed. Now it was time to move forward. Peter stood as well, his legs unsteady at first, his body still tired from the long night of fishing. But his heart was light in a way it had not been since the night of the denial. He felt clean, renewed, restored. Not because he had earned it or deserved it, but because Jesus had given it freely. The other disciples gathered around, sensing that something significant had happened. They did not need to know all the details. They could see the change in Peter. The weight that had been pressing on him was gone. The shadow that had darkened his face was lifted. He stood taller now, not with the false bravado he had once displayed, but with a quiet confidence rooted in grace. Jesus looked at all of them, his disciples, his friends, the ones he had chosen and trained and loved. He had work for them to do, a message for them to carry, a church for them to build, and he would be with them, in power if not in physical presence, as they went out into the world. But first, there had been this moment, this fire, this breakfast, this restoration. Because before Peter could feed others, he needed to be fed. Before he could tend the sheep, he needed to be tended. Before he could lead, he needed to be restored. And Jesus had done all of that gently and thoroughly, beside a charcoal fire on the shore of the Sea of Galilee as the sun rose on a new day. Chapter 9. From Shame to Leadership. The weeks that followed were transformative. Peter did not suddenly become perfect. He did not stop making mistakes or struggling with doubt. But something fundamental had shifted in him. The shame that had defined him after the denial no longer controlled him. He had been seen at his worst, by Jesus, by himself, by God. And he had not been rejected. He had been restored. The change in Peter was evident to everyone who knew him. Where once he had been hesitant and withdrawn, weighed down by guilt, now he moved with purpose. Not the reckless, impulsive confidence he had displayed before the denial, but something deeper and more solid. A confidence rooted not in his own strength, but in the grace that had lifted him up when he fell. When the disciples returned to Jerusalem, Peter took his place among them not as an outsider or a failure, but as a leader. The other disciples did not hold his denial against him. They had all abandoned Jesus in their own ways. They had all failed to understand, to believe, to stand firm. Peter's failure was simply the most visible, the most dramatic. But in being restored so publicly and completely, Peter became a living testimony to the grace that was available to all of them. The day of Pentecost came, 50 days after the resurrection. The disciples were gathered together in Jerusalem waiting as Jesus had commanded them, praying and preparing for whatever came next. And then the Holy Spirit came upon them with power, the sound of a mighty rushing wind, tongues of fire resting on each of them, the gift of speaking in languages they had never learned. The city was filled with Jewish pilgrims from every nation, gathered for the festival. They heard the disciples speaking in their own languages, proclaiming the mighty works of God. Some were amazed, others mocked, saying the disciples were drunk. And it was Peter who stood up to address the crowd. Peter, who had once denied Jesus out of fear of a servant girl, now stood before thousands and proclaimed Jesus boldly. Peter, whose voice had once said, "I do not know the man," now declared, "Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Master and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." The transformation was stunning. The same man who had hidden in fear now stood in the centre of Jerusalem, in the same city where Jesus had been executed, and proclaimed the resurrection to the very people who had called for his death. Peter did not soften the message. He did not try to make it palatable. He spoke the truth plainly and powerfully, driven not by his own courage but by the Holy Spirit and the certainty of his own restoration. "Brothers, what shall we do?" the crowd cried out, convicted by Peter's words. And Peter told them, "Repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of your sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." 3,000 people believed that day. 3,000 people were baptized and added to the church. And the movement that had seemed to die on the cross began to spread like wildfire through Jerusalem and beyond. Peter became the leader of the early church. He preached. He performed miracles. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. He confronted the religious authorities who had condemned Jesus, speaking with a boldness that astonished them. The same religious leaders who had intimidated him into denial now marvelled at his courage and recognized that he had been with Jesus. He was arrested, threatened, beaten, but he did not recant. He did not deny. He did not run away. Instead, he rejoiced that he was counted worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. The fear that had once controlled him was gone, replaced by a love that cast out fear. Peter wrote letters to the churches, letters that would be preserved as scripture, letters that spoke of suffering and glory, of trials and faith, of the living hope that believers have through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in those letters, his own experience of failure and restoration echoed through every word. He wrote about humility, about the importance of humbling oneself under the mighty hand of God. He wrote about shepherding the flock of God, caring for them not out of compulsion but willingly, not for shameful gain but eagerly, not domineering over them but being examples. He wrote from experience, from the knowledge of what it meant to fail and be restored, to fall and be lifted up. Years passed. The church grew. Peter travelled, preaching the gospel, establishing churches, strengthening believers. He went to Antioch, to Corinth, perhaps to Rome. Everywhere he went, he carried the message of grace, the message that God uses broken people, the message that failure is not final, the message that the same Jesus who died and rose again meets us in our darkest moments and calls us to follow him again. And ultimately, as Jesus had foretold, Peter gave his life for the faith he had once denied. Tradition holds that Peter was crucified in Rome during the persecution under the Emperor Nero. The early church historian records that Peter, when facing execution, requested to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as his master. Whether the detail is historical or symbolic, it captures the essence of who Peter had become, a man so transformed by grace that he considered his own suffering a privilege if it brought glory to Jesus. The Peter who died for Christ was not the same Peter who had denied him. He was a man who had been broken and remade, a man who had failed and been restored, a man whose weakness had become part of his testimony, proof that God does not use the flawless. He uses the faithful. He uses those who, despite their failures, say yes to his call and follow him. From the courtyard where he denied Jesus to the beaches where he was restored to the cities, where he preached to the place of his martyrdom, Peter's life became a living demonstration of the power of grace. He had once asked Jesus, "How many times shall I forgive my brother who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus had answered, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times." Peter had learned what that meant. He had experienced it, and he had become a living embodiment of it. The fire on the beach had changed everything, not because it erased the past, but because it redeemed it. Jesus could have ignored Peter's denial. He could have moved on without addressing it, but instead, he created a moment of healing. He invited Peter to affirm his love 3 times, mirroring the 3 denials, transforming each memory of failure into a declaration of devotion. Peter's shame was not minimized, it was acknowledged, and in being acknowledged, it was healed. Epilogue, the fire that healed, not condemned. There are moments in life when we believe we have gone too far, when we have failed too deeply, when the weight of our regret feels too heavy to carry. We convince ourselves that we have disqualified ourselves from purpose, from calling, from grace. We believe that God might forgive us, but he could never use us again. We imagine that our failure has written the final chapter of our story, that the best we can hope for is to live quietly with our shame and try not to cause more damage. Peter believed that. Standing in the courtyard beside the charcoal fire, denying the one he loved, he could not have imagined that a few weeks later he would stand beside another fire and be restored. He could not have known that his failure would not be the end of his story, but a chapter within it. He could not have seen that the same Jesus he denied would one day entrust him with the leadership of the church. He could not have predicted that his name would be remembered not primarily for his denial but for his faithfulness, his leadership, his martyrdom, his legacy. But that is exactly what happened, because God does not measure us by our worst moments. He does not define us by our failures. He sees the whole story, the denial and the restoration, the fall and the rising, the fear and the courage that comes after. He sees not just who we have been, but who we are becoming. Not just what we have done, but what he can do through us. The fire on the beach was not a place of condemnation. It was a place of healing. Jesus did not bring Peter there to shame him, but to free him. He asked the 3 questions not to wound, but to restore. He gave the 3 commissions not as a test, but as a gift. He created a moment that acknowledged the past while opening the door to the future. And in doing so, Jesus showed us something essential about the nature of grace. It is not something we earn by being good enough. It is something we receive by being honest enough. Honest about our failure. Honest about our need. Honest about our love, however imperfect it may be. Peter's story is the story of every person who has ever felt disqualified. It is the story of second chances, of new beginnings, of grace that meets us not at our best but at our lowest and lifts us up again. It is the story of a God who does not abandon us when we fail him, but pursues us, prepares breakfast for us, asks us gently if we love him, and then invites us to continue following him. The world is full of people who carry shame like Peter did. People who have denied Jesus in 1,000 different ways. People who have failed in their marriages, their careers, their callings. People who have made mistakes they cannot undo, spoken words they cannot take back, made choices they cannot unmake. People who lie awake at night replaying their failures, wondering if they have disqualified themselves from the life they were meant to live. To all of them, the story of Peter speaks a word of hope. You are not defined by your worst moment. Your failure is not your identity. The story is not over. God is still writing, still working, still calling you to follow him. The fire on the shore still burns, metaphorically speaking, in the heart of God. Not with the heat of judgment, but with the warmth of invitation. Jesus still calls us to come, to sit, to eat, to answer his questions, to receive his commission. He still asks in 1,000 different ways through 1,000 different circumstances, "Do you love me?" And if we can answer yes, even with a broken voice, even with tears, even with the memory of our failures pressing on our hearts, then he will speak the same words he spoke to Peter, "Follow me." And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The sun rises over the Sea of Galilee. The nets are full. The fire burns low. and the one who was denied stands restored, ready to feed the sheep, ready to follow, ready to live a life defined not by his failure, but by the grace that met him on the shore. God does not end our story at our lowest moment. He meets us there and continues it. He takes our broken pieces and makes something beautiful. He takes our denials and transforms them into declarations. He takes our shame and replaces it with purpose. This is the gospel. This is the good news. Not that we are perfect, but that we are loved. Not that we never fail, but that failure is not final. Not that we earn grace, but that grace is freely given to all who will receive it. Peter received it on a beach beside a charcoal fire, and his life was never the same. Not because he became perfect, but because he became willing. Willing to be honest, willing to be restored, willing to follow Jesus again, even after he had failed him. And that willingness, that simple, humble willingness to say yes to grace, changed the world. Through Peter's preaching, thousands came to faith. Through his leadership, the church was established. Through his letters, generations of believers have been strengthened and encouraged. Through his martyrdom, the power of the gospel was demonstrated in the most final and convincing way possible. All because Jesus met him on the shore and said, "Follow me." The same invitation is extended to us. Whatever we have done, however we have failed, wherever we have run, Jesus stands on the shore of our lives calling us to come, to be restored, to be commissioned, to follow. The question is not whether we are worthy. The question is whether we are willing. Peter was willing. And the world was changed because of it. The fire that healed, not condemned, still burns. And Jesus still stands beside it, waiting, preparing breakfast, ready to transform our greatest failures into our most powerful testimonies, ready to take the deniers and make them into shepherds, ready to take the broken and make them into builders of his kingdom. This is the story of Peter by the fire, but it is also your story and mine, because we all stand by fires of our own making, carrying shame we cannot shake, wondering if we have gone too far. And to all of us, Jesus says the same thing he said to Peter. I know what you did, I know where you failed, I know what you are carrying, and I am here to tell you that it is not over, that you're not disqualified, that I still have work for you to do, that I am calling you still, that I love you still, that you can follow me still. Feed my sheep. The world needs what you have to offer, not your perfection, but your testimony, not your strength, but your story of how my grace was sufficient for your weakness. Go and tell them what I have done for you. Go and show them that failure is not final. Go and be living proof that I restore those who come to me honestly, humbly, with nothing to offer but their love and their willingness to try again. Come, have breakfast, and then follow me. The dawn breaks, the day begins, and those who have been restored by grace rise to follow the one who called them, not because they are perfect, but because they are loved, and that makes all the difference. Hello, beloved friends. Before we begin tonight's journey into peaceful rest, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining from and what time it is in your corner of creation. The gentle voice of the shepherd reaches across all borders and time zones. If these stories bring you comfort and peace, please remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more scripture-inspired sleep journeys. Now, let us quiet our minds and open our hearts as we listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd. In the quiet of this moment, I invite you to find a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already settled in bed, your head resting on your pillow, or maybe you're preparing for rest after a long day. Wherever you are, however you've arrived at this moment, know that you are welcomed here with tenderness and care. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of your body surrendering to the support beneath you. Notice how your shoulders can soften, how your hands can rest without grasping, how your face can release any tension it's been holding. There's nothing you need to do right now except breathe and listen. Let's breathe together for a moment. Inhale slowly through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. Hold it gently for just a moment, and then exhale through your mouth, releasing anything that doesn't serve your peace. Inhale comfort. Exhale worry. Inhale divine peace. Exhale human striving. Inhale rest. Exhale burden. With each breath, you're creating space within yourself. Space for stillness, space for quiet, space for the gentle voice that calls you by name. I invite you now to begin visualizing a journey. As you continue breathing slowly and deeply, imagine yourself walking along a narrow country path. It's late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun bathes everything in a warm glow. The air is perfect, not too warm, not too cool, and carries the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. The path winds gently through rolling hills. With each step you feel more of your daily concerns falling away. The emails waiting for responses, the conversations that left you wondering, the tasks still uncompleted, all of these can wait outside this peaceful moment. As you walk, you notice the sound of birdsong in the distance, not the busy chattering songs of morning birds, but the gentle settled sounds of evening, soft calls that seem to whisper, "All is well, rest is coming." The path begins to crest a small hill, and as you reach the top you see before you a wide meadow. The grass sways gently in a soft breeze, creating waves of movement like a green sea. Scattered throughout are wildflowers in gentle hues, pale yellows, soft whites, and tender purples. At the far edge of this meadow, you can just make out the stone walls of an ancient sheepfold, a place of gathering, a place of safety, a place of rest. This is where our journey is taking us tonight, to the sheepfold of the Good Shepherd. As you descend the hill toward the meadow, you feel a sense of being both completely free and completely held. The vast open sky above reminds you of boundless possibility, while the path beneath your feet assures you that you're being guided. With each step, your breathing continues to deepen. Your inhales become fuller, your exhales become longer. Your mind begins to quiet like waters settling after a storm. The path now leads you into the meadow itself. The grass reaches up past your ankles, brushing against you with feather-like touches. You can feel the earth beneath your feet, solid, supportive, ancient. As you walk, you begin to notice the sounds of sheep in the distance, not loud or disturbing, but the gentle bleating that speaks of contentment and security. They're calling to one another as they make their way toward the sheepfold for the night. And then you hear something else, a voice. Low and warm, it carries across the meadow with remarkable clarity. It's not calling to you, not yet, but to the sheep. And you notice how they respond, turning their heads, adjusting their path, moving with purpose toward the voice. This is the voice of the shepherd, calling his sheep to evening rest. Each one knows this voice intimately. Each one trusts this voice implicitly. Each one follows this voice instinctively. As you continue your walk through the meadow, drawn toward the sheepfold just as the sheep are drawn, you begin to feel a sense of recognition stirring within you. Something about this voice awakens a deep memory. not from yesterday or last year, but from the very foundation of your being. It's as if your soul remembers this voice from before time began. The path begins to widen as you near the sheepfold. The stone walls become clearer now, smooth, weathered stones carefully placed one upon another by hands that understood the importance of creating sanctuary. These walls have stood through countless seasons, through rain and wind and snow and sun, remaining steadfast in their purpose, to protect, to shelter, to create a space of safety. As you draw nearer, you see the entrance to the sheepfold, a simple opening in the wall. There is no gate of wood or metal, for in this place, in this story, the shepherd himself serves as the gate. Nothing enters that is not first approved by him. Nothing threatens that is not first faced by him. The voice continues to call, naming each sheep individually, knowing each one's unique needs, tendencies, and nature. And as the sun begins to sink lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the meadow, you find yourself at the entrance to the sheepfold, ready to cross the threshold into deeper rest. As you stand at the entrance to the sheepfold, you pause to take in its simple beauty. The circular stone walls rise about 4 feet high, tall enough to keep the sheep secure, yet low enough that the shepherd can see over them to watch for any approach of danger. The stones themselves seem to hold stories, their surfaces marked by time and weather, yet their arrangement remains sturdy and true. The ground inside the sheepfold has been softened by the passage of countless sheep over many years. What might once have been rocky earth has become a cushioned, almost velvety surface, perfect for rest. In some areas, particularly along the inside edge of the wall, tufts of soft grass have grown, creating natural pillows for weary heads. You notice that while the day remains warm, there is a coolness gathered in the shadows of the walls, a reminder that night approaches and with it the deeper rest that darkness brings. The air here carries a different quality. Sheltered from the breeze that moves across the open meadow, it feels somehow more concentrated, more present. As you step inside, crossing the threshold where the shepherd stands watch, you feel a subtle shift in your awareness. The sounds of the wider world seem to soften. The concerns that normally occupy your thoughts recede further. Here, within these ancient walls, existence becomes simpler. There is no need to navigate complex decisions or manage difficult relationships. There's only the present moment, the approaching night, and the protective presence of the shepherd. You find a place to sit against the wall where the last rays of sunlight still warm the stones. From here, you can watch as the sheep continue to arrive, each responding to its name when called, each receiving a gentle touch from the shepherd as it passes by him into the fold. This is how it has been done for thousands of years in the hill country. This ancient rhythm of call and response, of leaving the wide pastures for the secure fold, of trusting the one who leads and protects. Nothing about this scene would look unfamiliar to someone from centuries past. The relationship between shepherd and sheep transcends time, speaking to something essential about care and trust. In ancient times, you remember hearing, shepherds would often combine their flocks during the day, allowing the sheep to graze together in larger numbers. But when evening came, each shepherd would call only to his own sheep, using distinctive sounds or words that only his flock recognized. Remarkably, the sheep would separate themselves, following only the voice they knew, never confused by the calls of other shepherds. As you observe this evening gathering, you notice the care with which the shepherd examines each sheep as it enters. His hands move gently over wool and skin, checking for injuries or thorns that might have been gathered during the day's wandering. For one sheep, he removes a small burr caught in the thick wool. For another, he applies a soothing balm to a minor scrape. No need goes unnoticed, no discomfort goes untended. The sheep themselves seem to welcome this attention. Though some are clearly tired from the day's grazing, they pause willingly for the shepherd's examination. There is trust in their stillness, contentment in their patience. They know these hands, they know this voice, they know they are cared for individually, specifically, attentively. As the fold fills with more sheep, you notice the distinctive sounds they make. Not the loud bleating of alarm, but the soft, low sounds of recognition and settlement. They are talking to each other and to the shepherd in their own language of belonging. The air begins to cool more noticeably as the sun touches the horizon. Long shadows stretch across the sheepfold, and the stone walls now provide not just security, but shelter from the light evening breeze. The shepherd moves among the gathered sheep, his presence clearly bringing them comfort. Some draw closer to him as he passes, seeking the reassurance of proximity. You watch as he kneels beside one sheep that seems particularly restless. He speaks softly to it, words you cannot quite hear from where you sit, but you can see the effect. The sheep's breathing slows, its movements still. Its eyes close in what can only be described as surrender to care. This, you realize, is what true safety looks like. Not the absence of all threat, but the presence of one who is trustworthy enough to allow complete vulnerability. The sheep do not need to remain vigilant because the shepherd stays watchful. They do not need to worry about provision because the shepherd knows where the sweet water flows and the tender grass grows. They do not need to fear the darkness because the shepherd's sight penetrates what they cannot see. As twilight deepens into early evening, a profound quiet descends upon the sheepfold. The activities of the day, the walking, the grazing, the occasional startled running, have given way to stillness. Energy spent has prepared the way for deep restoration. The shepherd now sits at the entrance to the fold, his back against one of the stone walls, his staff across his lap. From this position, he can see both outward across the meadow and inward to the gathered flock. Nothing approaches without his knowledge. Nothing disturbs without his permission. In this ancient pattern, in this timeless scene, you feel your own breathing continuing to slow, your own thoughts continuing to quiet. The simple rightness of this place seeps into your awareness. The stone walls that have sheltered generations, the soft earth that welcomes rest, the attentive presence that makes vulnerability safe. As night begins to embrace the world outside the fold, you feel yourself drawn deeper into the peace of this sanctuary. The voice of the shepherd, which first called across the meadow, now speaks in the silence of complete trust. And though no words are spoken aloud, you understand with perfect clarity. You are known. You are seen. You are safe. As the night deepens around the sheepfold, the stars begin to appear overhead. First one, then another, then suddenly a multitude, transforming the darkness into a vast canvas of light. The shepherd remains at his post, a silhouette of watchful presence against the night sky. In this moment of perfect stillness, words from ancient scripture rise in your mind, words that have brought comfort to countless souls through the centuries. The 10th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus describes himself as the Good Shepherd, speaks with particular resonance in this place of safety and rest. Listen now, as the words flow gently into your consciousness. Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. Pause and consider this image of the gate. In ancient sheepfolds like this one, the shepherd would often position himself in the opening of the wall, literally becoming the gate. Nothing could enter without passing by him first. No predator could threaten. No thief could steal. No sheep could wander away without encountering the shepherd's watchful presence. Imagine now what it means to have such protection. Not a cold barrier of wood or metal, but a living, attentive guardian who knows each one by name. This is not distant security, but intimate care. This is not impersonal safety, but relationship-based protection. The words continue to unfold. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Reflect on the difference between hired protection and devoted care. The difference is not in skill or strength, but in relationship and commitment. The Good Shepherd's connection to the sheep is not a transaction but a bond. His protection flows not from duty but from love. As you gaze across the sheepfold, you can see this truth embodied in the shepherd's posture, alert but relaxed, vigilant but peaceful. His attention never wavers, yet it carries no tension. This is the watching that comes from love rather than obligation. The sacred text continues, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Imagine being known, fully known, and still loved without hesitation. Not the surface knowing of casual acquaintance, but the deep knowing that sees every fear, every hope, every quiet corner of your heart. The shepherd knows when you are afraid, when you are lonely, when you are in pain. He knows when you have wandered, when you have stumbled, when you have fallen, and still he calls your name with tenderness. This knowing is not one-directional. The sheep also know their shepherd. They recognize his voice among all others. They trust his guidance without question. They follow his leading with confidence because experience has taught them that he brings them to good places, to fresh water, to green pastures, to safe rest. As these words settle into your spirit, another passage emerges. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. There is a certainty in these words, a promise of security that transcends physical safety. The shepherd's care extends beyond the immediate dangers of wolves and thieves to the deeper threats of meaninglessness and separation. His protection covers not just the body but the soul. His provision satisfies not just physical hunger but spiritual longing. As you reflect on these words, you notice the sheep in the fold have arranged themselves in a pattern that seems both random and intentional. Some cluster together for warmth, others maintain a small space of separation. Some lie with their heads toward the centre, others face the walls. Each has found the position that brings them comfort, yet all remain within the protective circle of the shepherd's care. Is this not a beautiful picture of community within security? Unity without uniformity? Each sheep is different, in size, in age, in temperament, yet all are equally valued, equally protected, equally known by name. The night has fully embraced the world now. The meadow beyond the sheepfold lies invisible in darkness, but here within the circle of stone walls there is no fear of what cannot be seen. The shepherd's presence transforms the night from a time of vulnerability to a season of rest. One more passage rises in your awareness. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. These words speak of expansion, of inclusion, of a circle of care that continues to widen. The shepherd's heart is not limited to those already gathered, but extends to those still wandering, still searching, still unsure of where they belong. As you let these ancient words settle deeply into your consciousness, you notice that the rhythm of your breathing is synchronized with the gentle rise and fall of the sleeping sheep around you. There is a harmony here, a natural community formed not by effortful connection, but by shared trust in the one who watches over all. The shepherd's eyes meet yours across the sheepfold, and in that glance you understand you too are invited into this circle of care. You too are known by name. You too are welcome to rest under the watchful eyes of the one who never slumbers. As the night grows deeper, something remarkable happens. The scene around you begins to shift, not in a jarring way, but with the gentle transformation of a dream unfolding. The walls of the sheepfold seem to dissolve, and you find yourself no longer sitting against the stones, but standing in an open field just as dawn begins to break on the horizon. The sheep are rising from their rest, stretching and shaking the night stillness from their bodies. The shepherd moves among them, speaking softly to each one, calling names that sound like music in the morning air. He turns to you now, his eyes finding yours with a gaze that feels at once ancient and immediate. With a small gesture of his hand, he invites you to join him as he prepares to lead the flock to fresh pastures. You rise and move toward him, feeling neither rushed nor hesitant. There is a rightness to this moment, as if it has been waiting for you through all the days of your life. "Come," he says, his voice both gentler and more compelling than you imagined. "Walk with me a while." As the sheep begin to follow the shepherd out into the wider fields, you find yourself walking alongside him. Not ahead, not behind, but beside, close enough to hear his breathing, to notice the deliberate placement of his feet on the earth, to feel the subtle movements of the air as he lifts his staff to guide the way. The morning unfolds around you in a symphony of sensory experiences. The earth beneath your feet feels solid yet yielding, supporting each step without resistance. The cool morning air carries the mingled scents of grass, wild flowers, and the earthy wool of the sheep. Light increases gradually as the sun climbs higher, illuminating the landscape in stages, first outlining the hills in gold, then filling the valleys with amber light, finally bathing everything in the clear radiance of full morning. You notice that the shepherd does not hurry. His pace is steady but unhurried, considerate of the youngest lambs and the oldest ewes. There is no sense of urgency, no anxiety about reaching a destination by a certain time. The journey itself holds as much importance as the arrival. The sheep need movement, the shepherd explains, seeming to read your thoughts, but they also need to feel secure in that movement. Too fast and they become anxious. Too slow and they begin to wander. The right pace creates both progress and peace. As you walk, you begin to notice how the sheep respond to the shepherd's voice. When he calls to one that has strayed too near a thorny thicket, it immediately adjusts its path. When he makes a particular clicking sound, the entire flock knows to pause and wait. When he sings a low melodic note, they gather more tightly together. "They know my voice," he says simply, "not just its sound, but its meaning." The path begins to ascend a gentle hill. As you climb, you notice how the shepherd positions himself, sometimes ahead to lead the way, sometimes behind to encourage those who lag, sometimes at the side to prevent wandering toward unseen dangers. The greatest deception, he comments, is the belief that freedom means absence of guidance. True freedom comes from trusting the one who sees what you cannot see. From the top of the hill, you can see the landscape spread out in all directions. To the east, where you've come from, the sheepfold stands solid and familiar. To the west, your direction of travel, a wide valley opens up, green with the new grass and dotted with the blue of morning flowers. To the north and south, other hills rise, creating a natural corridor for your journey. The shepherd pauses here, allowing the sheep to rest for a moment and take in the wider view. He stands slightly apart, his eyes scanning the horizon with attentive care. You understand that he is looking for signs of danger, assessing weather patterns, planning the safest route forward. "Every step we take has been imagined before we take it," he says, again responding to your unspoken thoughts. "I walk these paths in my mind before I walk them with my feet. That is how I can lead with confidence even into new territories." As the journey resumes, you begin to notice the distinct personalities of the sheep around you. Some walk with the confidence of experience, staying close to the shepherd out of choice rather than fear. Others move with the uncertainty of youth, sometimes darting ahead, sometimes falling behind, requiring more of the shepherd's attention. One sheep in particular catches your notice and slightly smaller than the others, with a slight limp that suggests an old injury. This one stays especially close to the shepherd, often walking directly beside him on the opposite side from where you walk. This one knows her need, the shepherd says, his voice warm with affection. She learned through difficulty what some never learn through ease, that proximity to me is better than independence from me. The sun is higher now, warming the air and bringing out the sweet scent of the crushed grass beneath your feet. The path descends into the valley, where a small stream cuts through the field, creating a natural stopping place. The sheep move eagerly toward the water, their thirst evident in their quickened pace. The shepherd guides them to the calmest part of the stream, where the water flows gently and the banks slope gradually. Here the sheep can drink without danger, refreshing themselves in the clear water. You kneel beside the stream yourself, cupping your hands to bring the cool water to your lips. It tastes sweeter than any water you've known before, clean and life-giving. Rest here a while, the shepherd says, settling himself on a smooth rock nearby. The journey continues, but never without restoration along the way. As you sit by the stream, watching the sheep drink and then begin to graze on the lush grass that grows along the banks, you feel a profound sense of being exactly where you are meant to be. There is no striving in this moment, no anxiety about what comes next, no regret about what came before. There is only the present reality of being on the path with the shepherd, moving at his pace, resting at his direction, continuing under his care. The soft sound of the stream, the gentle movements of the grazing sheep, the watchful presence of the shepherd, all combine to create a sense of security so deep that you feel your entire being relaxing into it. This is what it means to be truly led, truly guided, truly known. As the sun reaches its zenith, bathing the valley in golden light, you close your eyes for a moment, allowing the warmth to wash over you. In this perfect stillness, you hear the shepherd's voice once more, not speaking to the sheep now, but to you. The path continues beyond what you can see, but do not be anxious about what lies ahead. I have walked it already. I know every turn, every hill, every valley, and I will never lead you anywhere that I have not prepared for you. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting longer shadows across the valley, you open your eyes to find the shepherd standing before you, his hand extended in invitation. Come, he says simply. There is something I want to show you before the day ends. You rise and follow him, noticing that the sheep have settled into a gentle rhythm of grazing. They seem content to remain in this lush valley for now, secure in the knowledge that the shepherd remains near. He leads you to a small rise overlooking the stream, where a single tree offers dappled shade. Its branches spread wide, creating a natural canopy that filters the sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow on the ground below. Sit with me here, he says, settling himself against the trunk of the tree. As you join him in the shade, you realise you can see the entire flock from this vantage point. Every sheep is visible, from the confident leaders to the hesitant followers, from the strong to the vulnerable. The shepherd's gaze moves over them with attentive care, missing nothing. Do you see how they graze without fear? He asks. They do not worry about predators or storms or scarcity. They have learned through experience that I provide what they need. I protect them from what would harm them. I guide them to places of abundance. You watch as the sheep move slowly through the grass, tapping to eat, occasionally looking up to confirm the shepherd's presence, then returning to their grazing with peaceful assurance. This is the gift I offer, the shepherd continues, not the absence of all danger, but the presence of constant care. Not the elimination of all difficulty, but the assurance of never facing it alone. Particularly small lamb catches your attention. It must be one of the newest born to the flock. It stays close to its mother, occasionally frolicking in short bursts of energy before returning to her side. Its wool is especially white, almost luminous in the afternoon light. The youngest ones, the shepherd observes, following your gaze, sometimes need to be carried. When the path grows steep or the day grows long, I lift them into my arms and bear their weight. They learn trust through being held. You consider this, the image of the strong shepherd carrying the vulnerable lamb, not with impatience at its weakness, but with tenderness for its need. Do you know, he asks, turning to look directly at you, that I would leave the 99 to find the one? If a single sheep wanders away, becomes lost, falls into danger, I go after it, not because it is more valuable than the others, but because each one is irreplaceable to me. Each one is known by name. Each one matters uniquely. The depth of commitment in his voice moves you deeply. This is not the impersonal care of a distant guardian, but the passionate attention of one who loves specifically, individually, completely. The Good Shepherd, he continues, lays down his life for the sheep, not because the sheep have earned such sacrifice, but because the shepherd's love makes them worth any cost. As he speaks these words, the light shifts, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. The air grows still, as if the world itself is listening to this truth. Many voices will call to you, the shepherd says softly. Some offering easier paths, some promising quicker rewards, some threatening what will happen if you don't follow them. But remember, my sheep know my voice. They recognize it among all others because they have spent time listening, because they have experienced its reliability, because they have found that following it always leads to life. He reaches out and places his hand on your shoulder, the weight of it both grounding and reassuring. You are not alone in the fields of this world, he says. Even when you cannot see me, I am watching. Even when you cannot hear me clearly, I am speaking. Even when you wander, I am seeking. This is the promise I make to each one who belongs to me. You will never be forgotten, never be abandoned, never be left without guidance. The sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon it will be time to lead the sheep back to the safety of the fold for the night. Trust and rest, the shepherd says, his voice a gentle command. These are the twins of peace. Trust that I know the way forward. Rest in the knowledge that you are watched over. Together they create a quiet heart even in the midst of a noisy world. As these words settle into your spirit, you notice that your breathing has slowed to match the shepherd's. Deep, unhurried breaths that seem to draw peace directly from the air around you. Your body feels heavy with relaxation, as if every muscle has decided at once to release its tension. The voice of love is always near, the shepherd murmurs, his words becoming almost musical in their rhythm. Calling you by name, inviting you to follow, promising presence through every valley and on every mountain top. The sheep are beginning to gather more closely now, sensing the approaching evening. Their movements become slower, their grazing more intermittent. They are preparing for the journey back to the fold. Step by step, you are led to peace, the shepherd continues, his voice growing softer, not in great leaps or sudden flights, but in the patient unfolding of a path walked in trust. Each day has its portion of guidance, each moment carries its own light. He rises now, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace the entire flock at once. The setting sun behind him creates a halo effect, illuminating his outline with golden light. It is time to return to the fold, he says, extending his hand to help you rise. The day's journey concludes, but the care never ends. Through the night I watch, through the darkness I guard. When morning comes again, we continue the path together. As you stand, you feel a profound sense of renewal, as if the simple act of walking with the shepherd, listening to his voice, observing his care for the sheep has restored something essential within you. The worries that had weighed on your mind seem distant now, replaced by a calm certainty that you are known, you're valued, you're guided. The shepherd lifts his voice in a distinctive call that immediately draws the attention of every sheep. They respond with remarkable unity, moving toward him from all directions, gathering into a more cohesive group for the journey home. This is how it has always been, he explains as you begin to walk beside him, the flock following behind. The sheep scattered in feeding, gathered in travelling, diverse in their individual needs, united in their common trust, each one unique, yet part of a greater whole. The path back to the sheepfold seems somehow shorter than the journey out, as if the familiarity of returning home compresses distance itself. The evening light casts long shadows ahead of you, leading the way toward rest. "You're safe," the shepherd says, his voice now barely above a whisper. "You're loved. You're guided." These words repeat like a gentle refrain as you walk, matching the rhythm of your steps, synchronizing with your heartbeat. They are not just sounds but promises, not just comfort but truth. They sink deeply into your consciousness, creating a foundation of peace that feels both new and somehow always known. As the sheepfold comes into view, its stone walls glowing with the last light of day, you feel a sense of completion. Not the end of a glory, but the closing of a circle that will open again with the dawn. The shepherd leads the flock through the entrance, counting each one, greeting each by name, ensuring that all who went out have returned safely. When the last sheep has entered the fold, the shepherd takes his place at the gateway, his staff across his knees, his gaze moving between the gathered flock and the darkening landscape beyond. He is the living gate, the constant guardian, the embodiment of care that does not slumber or sleep. "Rest now," he says to you, his eyes holding yours with gentle intensity. The shepherd knows your name. The shepherd calls you to rest. The voice of love is always near. As night embraces the world once more, as stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, you feel yourself surrounded by perfect peace, held in the care of the one who calls you by name, who leads you beside still waters, who restores your soul. In this sanctuary of trust, sleep comes not as escape but as gift, not as absence but as presence in the watchful love of the Good Shepherd. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey with the Good Shepherd. If these words have brought you comfort tonight, please consider subscribing to Sacred Rest for more scripture-inspired sleep stories. And I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. May you rest deeply in the knowledge that you are watched over with perfect care through this night and always. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask for your support in a few small ways that make a huge difference for this channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps more than you could possibly know and allows us to keep creating these stories for you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us reach more listeners who might love this content as much as you do. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy these documentary-style biblical narratives, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. Your support means everything. Now, let's begin. There is a particular kind of danger that comes not from what we do not know, but from what we are absolutely certain we understand. Ignorance can be corrected with information, with teaching, with experience. But certainty, especially the kind that wraps itself around our ego and our sense of importance, creates a blindness more complete than any physical darkness ever could. This is a story about a prophet who could see into the spiritual realm, who could speak words that carried the weight of divine authority, who was sought after by kings and feared by nations. And yet, when it mattered most, he could not see what was directly in front of him. His own donkey, an animal considered among the least intelligent of beasts, possessed a clarity of vision that the prophet himself had lost. Sometimes God speaks through the voices we expect, sometimes through scripture, through prayer, through the counsel of the wise. But sometimes, in moments that humble us completely, God chooses to speak through those we would never imagine, through the simple, through the overlooked, through the powerless. Tonight's story takes us back more than 3,000 years to a dusty road in the ancient Near East, to a confrontation between a man convinced of his own righteousness and a divine messenger sent to stop him. It is a story about pride and humility, about spiritual blindness and sudden sight, about the moment when everything we thought we understood is turned completely upside down. This is the story of Balaam and his donkey, and it begins not with the donkey at all, but with a reputation that had spread across kingdoms. Chapter 1. A prophet with a reputation. In the hills east of the Jordan River, in a region that would later be known as the land of Moab, there lived a man whose name carried weight in every palace and court for hundreds of miles in every direction. His name was Balaam, son of Beor, and he was known as a seer, a diviner, a prophet whose words could alter the course of nations. Balaam was not an Israelite. He did not belong to the covenant people, did not worship in their manner, did not follow their laws, yet he possessed something that transcended tribal boundaries and national identities. He had access to the divine. When Balaam spoke blessing, prosperity followed. When he pronounced curse, calamity came. Kings and princes sought his services. Merchants paid him handsomely for favourable words over their ventures. Warriors wanted his blessing before battle. His reputation was not built on tricks or sleight of hand. Balaam genuinely heard from God. The Lord spoke to him, revealed things to him, used him as a mouthpiece for divine will. This made Balaam unique, dangerous, and extremely valuable. In a world where the favour of the gods could mean the difference between abundance and starvation, between victory and defeat, between life and death, Balaam held a power that most men could only dream of possessing. He lived well. His home was comfortable, built of stone and timber in the style common to that region, with rooms that stayed cool even in the heat of midday. His servants attended to his needs without being asked. His storerooms held grain and oil enough to last through any season. His reputation afforded him respect wherever he travelled. People stepped aside when he walked through marketplaces. When he spoke, others listened. He had learned to carry himself with the bearing of someone who knows they are important, who understands their own worth, who has been told too many times that they are special. The donkey that would later save his life had been with him for years. It was a reliable animal, sturdy and patient, the kind of beast that carried its burdens without complaint and navigated difficult terrain with sure feet. Balaam had ridden this donkey through mountain passes and across desert valleys, to meetings with nobles and consultations with merchants. The animal knew its master's habits, responded to the subtle pressure of his legs, stopped when he pulled the reins and moved forward when he urged it on. In all those years of faithful service, the donkey had never given Balaam any reason to doubt its reliability. It had never balked at a journey, never refused a command, never acted in any way that seemed irrational or stubborn. It simply did what donkeys do, carrying its master wherever he needed to go, asking nothing in return except food and water and occasional rest. And perhaps that was where the first seeds of Balaam's blindness were planted. Not in malice, not in deliberate evil, but in the slow accumulation of certainty that he, Balaam, understood how the divine world operated, that he knew when God was speaking and when God was silent, that his connection to the spiritual realm was something he could navigate with confidence and control. He had forgotten, if he ever truly knew, that God is not a force to be managed or a power to be channeled according to human preference. God is sovereign. God speaks when God chooses, and God will use whatever means necessary to ensure that the divine will is accomplished, even if it means humbling those who claim to speak in the divine name. Balaam had developed a system, a way of understanding his prophetic calling that made sense to him. He would seek God's guidance before taking on any commission. He would wait for divine instruction, and then, having received that instruction, he would proceed with confidence that he was operating within God's will. It seemed rational. It seemed spiritual. It seemed like exactly the kind of careful, respectful approach that a true prophet should take. But there was a flaw in this system, one that Balaam himself could not see. The flaw was in assuming that once he had received permission, the matter was settled. That having asked God and received an answer, he could then proceed according to his own understanding without further need for divine guidance or correction. He did not understand that permission is not the same as approval, that God sometimes allows us to make choices that God does not endorse, because forcing obedience would eliminate the very freedom that makes our choices meaningful. That being allowed to do something and being blessed in doing it are two entirely different realities. Balaam's reputation had spread far. Kings in distant lands knew his name. Traders spoke of him in caravans crossing the desert. His fame had reached even to the royal palace in Moab, where a worried king was about to make him an offer that would test everything Balaam believed about himself and his relationship with God. But reputation, as he was about to discover, is a fragile thing when it conflicts with the purposes of the Almighty. Chapter 2. The Fear of a King. 200 miles to the southwest in the royal palace of Moab, a different kind of man sat on his throne and worried. King Balak, son of Zippor, had received reports that filled him with a dread that kept him awake through the long desert nights. The Israelites were coming, not as scattered refugees, not as weak nomads begging for passage. They came as a nation, hundreds of thousands strong, moving through the wilderness like a force of nature. Balak had heard what they had done to the Amorites, how they had defeated King Sihon and King Og, how entire armies had been swept away before them. The stories spoke of a God who fought for them, who parted seas and brought water from rocks and rained bread from heaven. Balak was a practical man, a ruler who understood power in concrete terms. He knew how to assess military strength, how to count soldiers and evaluate weapons and judge the quality of fortifications. By every conventional measure, his kingdom should have been able to defend itself. Moab had walls, trained warriors, strategic positions in the rocky highlands that made invasion difficult. But these Israelites were not a conventional threat. The reports described something beyond normal military capability. They spoke of a people who had walked through a sea on dry ground while their enemies drowned behind them. Of a nation that had survived for decades in a desert that should have killed them within weeks. Of battles where the sun itself stood still to give them victory. Of walls that fell at the sound of trumpets. Balak's advisors had brought him eyewitness accounts from survivors of the battles with the Amorite kings. These were not exaggerated tales passed from mouth to mouth until truth disappeared beneath layers of legend. These were direct testimonies from men who had fought against Israel and barely escaped with their lives. They described an army that fought with impossible courage, as though they knew they could not lose. They spoke of moments in battle when it seemed the very elements fought on Israel's behalf, when dust storms blinded their enemies at crucial moments, when water sources appeared exactly when Israel needed them and dried up to deny their pursuers. They told of a cloud that guided the Israelite camp, visible to all, moving when the people moved and resting when they rested. This was not merely a military problem. This was a spiritual crisis. Balak understood that conventional warfare might not be enough against a people protected by such a deity. He needed something more, something beyond swords and spears. He needed spiritual warfare. And that was when his advisors spoke the name that every king in the region knew, Balaam. The stories about Balaam were almost as numerous as the stories about Israel. A merchant blessed by Balaam had become wealthy beyond measure. A king who had sought Balaam's curse against his enemies had watched those enemies fall to plague and internal strife. A farmer given Balaam's blessing had harvested crops so abundant that his neighbours spoke of it for years afterward. But it was not just the stories of blessing that made Balaam valuable. It was also the stories of his curses. A prince who had offended Balaam had died under mysterious circumstances within the month. A rival diviner who had challenged Balaam's authority had lost. His gift entirely, reduced to speaking empty words that no longer carried any power. A city that had refused to pay Balaam what he demanded had suffered a drought that lasted 3 years. Whether all these stories were true or not was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that people believed them, and belief itself is a form of power in a world where the line between the physical and spiritual realms was understood to be permeable and constantly shifting. Balak sent for his most trusted elders and princes. He summoned the leaders of Midian, their allies in this growing crisis. Together they crafted a message, simple and direct. They would offer Balaam whatever he wanted, whatever price he named, if he would come and curse these Israelites. If Balaam spoke words of curse over them, perhaps their God would turn away, perhaps their protection would fail, perhaps they could be defeated after all. The delegation was assembled with care. These were not ordinary messengers. They were important men, elders who commanded respect in their own communities, princes who sat in council with the king himself. Their presence would communicate the seriousness of Balak's request and the genuine desperation behind it. They were given money for the journey, substantial amounts of silver wrapped in leather pouches. They carried gifts for Balaam, items of value that would demonstrate Balak's wealth and willingness to reward the prophet generously. They wore fine clothing, the kind that marked them as representatives of royal power. Everything about their appearance and bearing was designed to impress upon Balaam that this was no ordinary request. They travelled for days through rocky terrain and across sandy valleys. The journey from Moab to Balaam's home was not an easy one. They passed through villages where they asked directions and traded for supplies. They crossed wadis that could become raging torrents in the rainy season, but now were nothing more than dry riverbeds. They climbed rocky paths where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. At night, they camped under stars so numerous and bright that the desert floor was bathed in their collective glow. They discussed among themselves what they would say to Balaam, how they would present their king's request, what arguments might convince him if he initially refused. They knew they were asking him to curse a people who seemed to have supernatural protection. They knew it was dangerous to oppose a god who could perform such mighty acts. But they also knew that Balaam had power of his own, and they hoped that whatever God spoke through Balaam might be strong enough to counter the God of Israel. Eventually, after days of travel, they arrived at the home of Balaam, the prophet whose words could change the fate of nations. They found him at his dwelling, a well-built structure that spoke of prosperity and status. They presented their case with the urgency of men who understood what was at stake. They described the threat of Israel in vivid terms, not exaggerating but simply reporting what they had seen and heard. They explained their king's fear, his assessment that military force alone might not be sufficient. They emphasized the desperate need for someone who could speak against this unstoppable force. Then they laid out the gifts they had brought. The silver gleamed in the light. The fine cloth draped across their arms showed quality that only the wealthy could afford. They made clear that this was merely a down payment, a gesture of good faith. If Balaam agreed to come, if he successfully cursed Israel, the rewards would be far greater. And then they waited for Balaam's answer, watching his face, trying to read whether their offer would be accepted or refused. Chapter 3. God's clear instruction. Balaam looked at the gifts spread before him. He listened to the urgent words of these important men who had travelled so far to seek his services. He considered the implications of what they were asking. This was not a small matter. This was not a merchant seeking blessing for his caravans or a farmer wanting good crops. This was a king requesting a curse against an entire nation. And not just any nation. These Israelites clearly had divine protection. Even Balaam, hearing the stories for the first time from these messengers, could recognize the marks of genuine supernatural intervention. The question was not whether their God was real and powerful. The question was whether Balaam's connection to the divine realm gave him authority that could operate against such protection. But Balaam, to his credit, did not answer immediately. Whatever else could be said about him, he understood that his power came from God and that using that power required divine permission. He had learned through years of experience that acting without proper authorization from the spiritual realm could bring disaster. The stories of prophets who had overstepped their bounds, who had spoken words, not given to them by God, who had suffered terrible consequences for their presumption, were well known throughout the region. He told the messengers to stay the night, to rest from their journey, to wait while he sought guidance. His servants prepared rooms for them, brought water for washing, set out food and wine. The delegation settled in, grateful for the hospitality even as they worried about what answer the morning would bring. That night, when the house was quiet and the messengers were sleeping, Balaam went to the place where he sought divine guidance. Perhaps it was a specific room in his house, a space set aside for prayer and meditation. Perhaps it was a high place outside, under the open sky where he felt closer to the realm of spirit. The text does not tell us the details of his practice, only that he brought the matter before God, and God came to him in the darkness. The divine voice spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. God asked who these men were that had come to his house. It was not a question born of ignorance. God knew who they were and why they had come. But the question gave Balaam the opportunity to articulate the situation himself, to speak out loud what was being asked of him. Balaam explained. Balak, king of Moab, had sent these messengers. They brought word that a people had come out of Egypt, that they covered the face of the land, that they had camped near Moab. The king wanted Balaam to come and curse these people, so that Balak might be able to fight against them and drive them away. He laid out the request honestly and completely. He did not try to minimize what was being asked, or hide the fact that this involved speaking against a people who appeared to be under divine protection. He presented the situation as it was and waited for God's response. And God's response was absolute. You must not go with them. You must not curse these people, because they are blessed. The instruction could not have been clearer. There was no ambiguity in these words, no room for interpretation or creative reframing. God had blessed Israel. They were under divine protection, and Balaam was explicitly, directly, unequivocally forbidden from speaking any curse against them. The message was as clear as any divine communication could possibly be. Do not go, do not curse them. They are blessed. In the morning, when the sun rose over the hills and the messengers stirred from their sleep and gathered to hear Balaam's answer, he delivered God's verdict to them plainly. He told them that the Lord had refused to let him go with them. He could not curse Israel. They should return to their king and tell him that Balaam would not be coming. Balaam did not offer excuses or explanations. He did not try to soften the refusal or suggest that perhaps with a larger offer he might reconsider. He simply stated the fact. God had said no, and therefore he would not go. The delegation left, disappointed but not entirely surprised. They had made their offer. The prophet had consulted his God. The answer was no. They gathered their things, mounted their animals, and began the long journey back across the desert to report their failure to King Balak. As they travelled, they discussed what had happened. Some of them had expected this outcome. After all, they were asking Balaam to curse a people who seemed to have extraordinary divine favour. It made sense that his God would refuse permission. Others felt that perhaps they had not offered enough, that maybe a larger gift or a more prestigious delegation might have changed the result. But they all agreed that they had presented their case as well as they could. They had been respectful, generous, clear about the urgency of the situation. If Balaam's God had refused permission, there was nothing more they could have done. For a brief moment the story could have ended there. Balaam had heard God's instruction. He had obeyed. He had turned down wealth and prestige and the favour of a king because God had told him not to go. In that moment he was faithful. In that moment he demonstrated the kind of obedience that should characterise anyone who claims to speak for the divine. His donkey continued eating grass in the field beside his house, unaware of the momentous decision that had just been made. The animal had no way of knowing that its master had just refused an offer that would have brought great wealth and honour. It simply lived its simple life, eating when it was hungry, drinking when it was thirsty, carrying loads when required, resting when permitted. But Balak was not a man who accepted no for an answer easily, and Balaam's moment of clear obedience was about to be tested in a way that would reveal what was truly in his heart. Chapter 4, The Second Invitation. When the first delegation returned to Moab with news of Balaam's refusal, King Balak did not abandon his plan. Instead, he escalated it dramatically. If Balaam would not come for the gifts offered by elders and princes, perhaps he would come for even more prestigious messengers bearing even greater rewards. Balak's desperation had only increased in the days since the first delegation departed. New reports had arrived of Israel's continued advance. They were not moving away. They were not showing any signs of turning aside or choosing a different route. They were camped near Moab's borders, and their presence felt like a sword hanging over the kingdom, ready to fall at any moment. Balak assembled a second delegation, larger and more impressive than the first. These were not merely elders and respected men. These were princes, officials who sat in the king's council, who wielded real political power, whose names were known throughout the region. Their presence itself was a message. The king was serious, the situation was desperate, and no expense would be spared to secure Balaam's services. They carried more gold, more silver, more precious gifts. They were authorized to make promises that went far beyond the initial offer. Balak had instructed them to tell Balaam that he could name his price, that whatever honor or reward Balaam desired would be granted, that the resources of the entire kingdom would be at his disposal if he would just come and curse Israel. The delegation travelled the same route the first group had taken, but they moved with even greater urgency. They knew that time was running out, that with each passing day Israel grew more firmly established near Moab's territory, that the window for effective action was closing. When they arrived at Balaam's home, he received them with courtesy, but also with a certain amount of caution. He had already refused this request once. He had already received clear instruction from God. What could possibly have changed that would make a second approach appropriate? But the princes made their case with skill and passion. They described the escalating crisis in Moab. They emphasized the trust their king was placing in Balaam by sending such a high-level delegation. They laid out the expanded offer in concrete terms that left nothing to imagination. Money beyond counting, honor that would last for generations, a place of influence in the court of a powerful king, political connections that could benefit Balaam for the rest of his life. And then they made clear that this was not just about payment. This was about recognition of Balaam's unique gifts, about acknowledging his power and importance, about treating him with the respect and deference that someone of his abilities deserved. They appealed not just to his desire for wealth, but to his sense of his own significance. Balaam listened to all of this, and something shifted inside him. He told them he could not go against the word of the Lord his God, even if Balak gave him a palace full of silver and gold. These were good words, spiritual words, the kind of statement that sounded like firm commitment to divine authority. But then he added something that revealed the change in his heart, a subtle shift that would prove to have enormous consequences. "Stay here tonight," he said, "and I will find out what else the Lord will tell me." What else the Lord would tell him? God had already spoken. The instruction had been clear and unambiguous. Do not go. Do not curse Israel. They are blessed. There was no what else to discover. The divine will had been communicated completely and without room for reinterpretation. But Balaam asked again anyway. Perhaps he told himself he was being thorough, being careful, making absolutely certain. Perhaps he convinced himself that circumstances had changed, that this new delegation with its greater promises and more prestigious messengers constituted a fundamentally different situation requiring fresh guidance. Perhaps he reasoned that God's previous refusal had been about the specific offer made by the first group, and that this enhanced offer might receive a different response. Or perhaps, deep in his heart where he did not want to look too closely, he simply wanted God to change the divine mind. He wanted permission to accept the wealth and honour being offered. He wanted both God's approval and Balak's gold. He wanted to believe that it was possible to serve divine purposes while also pursuing his own interests. The princes settled in for the night, more hopeful than the first delegation had been. The fact that Balaam was asking God again suggested that he wanted to go, that he was looking for a way to make this work, that the enhanced offer had accomplished what the first one could not. That night, Balaam went again to seek divine guidance. He brought the matter before God a second time, explaining the situation as though God might have forgotten the first conversation, or might not understand the new circumstances. And God spoke to him again. The divine response was complex, layered with meaning that Balaam would later have reason to reflect on carefully. God said, "Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you." God gave permission. Balaam could go. But the permission came with a condition so clear it could not be missed. Do only what I tell you. Not what Balak wanted. Not what Balaam himself might desire. Not what would maximize his reward or enhance his reputation. Only what God commanded. And there was something else in this permission. Something that Balaam should have recognized if he'd been paying attention to the spiritual currents beneath the surface of the words. God was angry. The text will later make this explicit, but the signs were there from the beginning for anyone with eyes to see them. God had said no. Balaam had asked again. And God, in allowing Balaam to go, was permitting him to learn a hard lesson about the difference between permission and blessing. In the morning, Balaam told the princes that he would come with them. Relief and satisfaction spread across their faces. They had succeeded where the first delegation had failed. The prophet would accompany them to Moab. King Balak would be pleased. Perhaps there was still hope for their nation after all. Balaam saddled his donkey, the same faithful animal that had carried him on countless journeys before. He gathered his things, took provisions for the trip, said whatever farewells were necessary to his household, and then he set out with the princes of Moab, heading southwest toward a destination that would test everything he believed about himself and his relationship with God. He was confident. God had given permission. He was going to Moab not in disobedience but with divine approval. He would go, he would listen to God, and he would speak only what the Lord commanded. Everything seemed proper. Everything seemed in order. He had followed the correct procedure, sought divine guidance, received an answer, and was now acting in accordance with that answer. As far as Balaam could see, he was being perfectly obedient. But God was angry, and the road ahead would make that anger impossible to ignore. Chapter 5. The Road That Changes. The road from Balaam's home toward the land of Moab wound through rocky terrain and narrow passages. It was not an easy journey even under the best circumstances. The path climbed through hills where loose stones could cause an animal to stumble. It descended into valleys where the heat collected and pressed down on travellers like a physical weight. It crossed open areas where there was no shade and the sun burned overhead from dawn until dusk. Balaam rode his donkey, surrounded by the princes of Moab who travelled with him. They made good progress that first day. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The air grew warm, then hot. The rhythmic sound of the donkey's hooves striking the packed earth created a steady cadence that was almost meditative in its consistency. The princes were in good spirits, talking among themselves about how pleased King Balak would be with their success, speculating about what Balaam would say when he finally saw the Israelite camp, discussing the proper ceremonies and sacrifices that would accompany the cursing ritual. They treated Balaam with deference and respect, as befitted someone of his reputation who was doing them such a great service. Balaam's mind was likely occupied with thoughts of what awaited him. How would he approach this task? What words would God give him to speak? How would Balak react when Balaam arrived? What would the cursing ceremony look like? Would it require specific actions, particular phrases, certain ritual objects? There was so much to consider, so much to plan. He had been in situations like this before, though never quite on this scale. He had blessed kings and cursed their enemies. He had spoken words of prosperity over crops and herds. He had pronounced divine favour on military campaigns and divine judgment on those who had offended. The gods! His experience told him what to expect, how these things typically unfolded, what results his words usually produced. But as Balaam contemplated the future, sitting comfortably on his donkey, and imagining the rewards that awaited him in Moab, something appeared on the road ahead that he did not see. An angel of the Lord took a position in the way, standing directly in the path that Balaam's donkey was following. This was not a gentle messenger bringing news of comfort or blessing. This was not one of the angels who appeared to announce births or deliver promises of divine favour. This angel held a drawn sword, raised and ready to strike. The spiritual realm had manifested in physical space, a divine warrior blocking the way forward with clear hostile intent. The angel's appearance would have been terrifying to anyone who could see it. The figure towered above human height, radiating power and authority. The sword in its hand was not a ceremonial object, but a weapon meant for killing, and the way it was positioned left no doubt about the angel's purpose. This messenger had been sent to stop Balaam, to oppose his journey, to make clear through action what words had apparently failed to communicate. Balaam saw nothing. His eyes, for all their prophetic ability, for all his reputation as a seer who could perceive spiritual truth, registered only an empty road stretching ahead. He continued talking with the princes, continued thinking about the future, continued riding forward without any awareness that death itself stood in his path. But the donkey saw. The animal's eyes, created by God to see what they needed to see, perceived the angel clearly. The terrifying figure blocking the road. The drawn sword raised to strike. The obvious and immediate danger. Every instinct in the donkey's body screamed that forward movement meant death, that continuing on this path would result in disaster. The donkey did what any creature with sense would do when confronted with an armed angel blocking its path. It turned aside, leaving the road and moving into an open field that bordered the way. Balaam, still seeing nothing unusual, felt only the sudden deviation from the proper route. One moment they were travelling smoothly along the road. The next moment his donkey had veered off into a field, moving away from their destination, refusing to stay on the path. Frustration flared immediately in Balaam's chest. Why was the animal misbehaving? They had a destination to reach, important business to conduct. The princes of Moab were watching. This was no time for the donkey to wander off the path like some untrained, undisciplined beast. He pulled hard on the reins, yanking the donkey's head to the side. When that did not produce the desired result quickly enough, he raised his staff and struck the animal, bringing the wood down hard against its side. The blow was meant to hurt, meant to punish, meant to communicate his anger and his demand for immediate obedience. The donkey, having no way to explain what it saw, no ability to make its master understand the danger, no means of communicating that it was trying to save his life, had no choice but to respond to the physical pain. It returned to the road, though every fibre of its being wanted to flee from the angel that still stood there, watching, waiting. The princes had noticed the incident but dismissed it as nothing significant. Donkeys sometimes acted stubborn or unpredictable. It was the nature of the animals. Balaam had corrected the problem quickly. They continued their journey, and ahead, still invisible to Balaam but clear as daylight to the donkey, the angel remained in position. The sword had not been lowered. The threat had not diminished. The spiritual opposition to this journey had not changed at all. They continued forward, moving deeper into the rocky terrain where the path would soon narrow even further. Chapter 6. The donkey presses against the wall the road, narrowed as they travelled deeper into the hills. On either side, stone walls rose up, the kind of natural passage that forms in areas where water has carved channels through limestone over countless centuries. The walls were not particularly high, perhaps twice the height of a man, but they were close enough that a rider's legs might brush against them if the animal strayed too near the edges. This was a common feature of travel in that region. The limestone hills were full of such passages, places where the stone had been worn away by seasonal floods until only narrow corridors remained. In the dry season, these passages made convenient roads, protected from wind and offering some shade during the hottest parts of the day. But they also limited options for movement. Once you entered one of these narrow ways, you were committed to following it until it opened up again. The princes continued their conversation, paying little attention to the geography. They had travelled roads like this many times before. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that required special attention or caution. And there, in this narrow passage, the angel appeared again. The divine messenger had moved ahead of them, positioning itself once more directly in their path, still holding the drawn sword, still presenting an obvious and immediate threat to anyone who could see, still making clear through its presence that this journey was opposed by heaven itself. The donkey saw the angel for the second time and understood the situation immediately. Forward movement was impossible. The angel blocked the entire width of the passage. To go forward would be to walk directly into the sword, to court death through willful blindness. But the donkey's master still could not see the danger, and the donkey was being urged forward, pressed by Balaam's legs and the commands of his voice to continue moving along the road. This time, with walls on both sides and no field to escape into, the animal did. The only thing it could. It pressed close against one wall, trying to squeeze past the angelic figure, trying to avoid the drawn sword while still obeying its master's direction to move forward. Perhaps if it stayed as far to one side as possible, it could slip by without coming into direct contact with the angel. But as the donkey pressed against the stone wall, Balaam's foot was caught between the animal's body and the rough surface. The impact was sudden and painful. Stone scraped against his leg. The pressure crushed his foot against the unyielding wall. Pain shot through his ankle and up into his calf. Balaam cried out in pain and fury. What was wrong with this animal? First it had wandered into a field for no reason. Now it was crushing his foot against a wall. The donkey had carried him safely for years, had never shown this kind of erratic, dangerous behaviour. But today, on this important journey, when he needed to arrive at Moab with dignity and composure, the donkey was acting like it had lost its mind. His anger flared even hotter than before. This was not just inconvenient, this was humiliating. The princes had witnessed the incident. They had heard him cry out in pain. What must they think of him? This great prophet who could not even control his own donkey. He struck the animal again, harder this time. The staff came down with real force, driven by frustration and pain and wounded pride. He hit the donkey multiple times, each blow expressing his rage at the situation, his embarrassment at appearing foolish in front of these important men, his complete inability to understand what was happening. The donkey moved away from the wall. Balaam's foot throbbed with pain. He would likely have bruises for days. He might even have trouble walking when they finally arrived in Moab. But at least the animal was behaving properly again, moving forward along the road as it should have been doing all along. The princes asked if he was all right. Balaam assured them he was fine, though his voice was tight with pain and barely suppressed anger. Just a stubborn animal, he said. Nothing to worry about. They would continue on, and they did continue, riding deeper into the narrow passage. The wall seemed to close in even tighter. The path became so constricted that there was barely room for a donkey to pass through. And ahead, in the narrowest section of the entire route, the angel took position one final time. Chapter 7. When the donkey speaks. The path had become so narrow that there was truly no room to turn to either side. Stone walls rose on both flanks, close enough that Balaam could have reached out and touched them simultaneously, if he extended both arms. The road itself was barely wide enough for the donkey to walk through. There was no space for manoeuvring, no option for going around an obstacle, no possibility of deviation. And there, Blocking the entire width of the passage, the angel stood with drawn sword. For the third time, the donkey saw what its master could not see. For the third time, the animal recognized that forward movement meant death. But this time, unlike the previous two encounters, there was absolutely no way around the obstacle. The donkey could not turn aside into a field, could not press against a wall and try to squeeze past, could not do anything except stop or walk directly into the angel's sword. The choice was clear. Forward meant death. The only option was to refuse to go forward. So the donkey stopped walking, and then, with Balaam still on its back, it folded its legs and lay down on the ground. The movement was careful and deliberate. The donkey did not buck or rear or try to throw its rider. It simply refused to continue any further and settled itself onto the path as if declaring that this journey had reached its end. For Balaam, this was the final straw. His anger reached its peak, exploding into rage that overwhelmed any remaining capacity for rational thought. The animal had wandered off the road. It had crushed his foot against a wall, and now it simply refused to move at all, lying down in the middle of the path like it had decided the journey was over. This was intolerable. This was unacceptable. This was a betrayal by an animal he had trusted for years, a creature that had never before given him any reason to doubt its reliability or obedience. He raised his staff and beat the donkey with all the frustration and rage that had been building since the journey began. The strikes fell hard against the animal's hide. Each blow carried the weight of Balaam's wounded pride, his embarrassment at appearing incompetent before the princes, his complete inability to understand why his normally obedient donkey had suddenly become impossible to control. And then something happened that had never occurred before in all of human history. Something so impossible that it should have immediately seized Balaam's complete attention and frozen him in wonder and terror. God opened the donkey's mouth, granting the animal the ability to form words and speak with human language. The voice that came from the donkey was clear and intelligible, formed with proper syntax and grammar, expressing rational thought in a way that should have been absolutely impossible for a beast of burden. "What have I done to you," the donkey asked, "that you have beaten me these 3 times? The question hung in the air, extraordinary and surreal. An animal was speaking, not making the typical braying sounds of a donkey, but actually forming human words, asking a reasonable question, engaging in verbal communication in a way that violated every natural law and every reasonable expectation about how the world worked. Any rational person, confronted with the impossible sight and sound of an animal speaking human language, would have been overwhelmed. They would have leaped from the donkey's back in shock and terror. They would have fallen to their knees, understanding immediately that they were in the presence of supernatural power. They would have questioned their sanity, or cried out for help, or done anything except respond to the donkey as if this were a normal conversation. But Balaam, blinded by his anger and his certainty that he understood the situation, simply answered the donkey as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You have made a fool of me," he said to the animal, his voice still hot with rage. "If I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." He threatened his own donkey with death, responding to the animal's reasonable question with murderous rage, completely failing to recognize that something miraculous was happening right in front of him. The donkey, now given the ability to speak, responded with another question, one that should have pierced through Balaam's rage and reached whatever remained of his wisdom. "Am I not your donkey, which you have ridden all your life until this day? Have I ever treated you this way? Before?" It was a perfectly logical question. The donkey was appealing to its own track record, to years of faithful service, to the fact that this behaviour was completely out of character and should therefore indicate that something unusual was happening. The animal was essentially asking Balaam to think, to consider whether there might be a reason for this unprecedented behaviour, to recognise that a faithful servant does not suddenly become rebellious without cause. And Balaam, still not grasping the magnitude of what was happening, answered simply, "No." He admitted that the donkey had never behaved this way before. He acknowledged that this was unusual, but even that admission did not penetrate the blindness that had overtaken him. He was having a rational conversation with his donkey about the donkey's behaviour pattern, discussing the animal's service record, debating whether its current actions were justified, and he saw absolutely nothing strange in this. The princes travelling with Balaam must have been watching this scene in stunned silence. What were they witnessing? A prophet having an argument with his donkey, and the donkey was talking back. Was this some kind of prophetic sign? Was Balaam performing some kind of mystical demonstration? Or had the heat and stress of the journey driven him to madness? But before anyone could process what they were seeing, before the full impossibility of a talking donkey could register in anyone's mind, everything changed. God opened Balaam's eyes. Chapter 8. Eyes finally opened. The change happened in an instant. One moment, Balaam saw only rock walls and an empty path and a stubborn donkey lying beneath him. The next moment, reality expanded to include what had been there all along, what had been invisible to him but clearly visible to his donkey, what explained everything that had happened since the journey began. The angel of the Lord stood in the way, towering and terrible, radiating power and authority, holding a drawn sword raised to strike. The spiritual realm made visible. The divine messenger who had been blocking their path from the beginning, who had been trying to stop Balaam from continuing this journey, who had positioned himself 3 separate times to make clear that heaven itself opposed what Balaam was doing. The sight was overwhelming. This was not a gentle vision or a peaceful revelation. This was a warrior angel with hostile intent, a divine being sent to kill Balaam if he continued forward. The sword in the angel's hand was raised and ready. The angel's posture made clear that this was not a warning or a symbolic gesture. This was an executioner ready to carry out a death sentence. Balaam's anger vanished instantly, replaced by terror so immediate and complete that it erased everything else from his mind. He fell off the donkey, throwing himself forward onto the ground, prostrating himself before the angel with his face pressed to the earth. Every instinct for self-preservation, every recognition of his own powerlessness before divine might, drove him down into the posture of absolute submission. He bowed with his face to the ground, trembling, waiting for the sword to fall. He had been riding directly toward this angel 3 separate times. He had been urging his donkey forward, striking the animal for refusing to walk into death, completely blind to the fact that his own beast of burden was saving his life with every act of supposed disobedience. And the angel spoke. The voice was not gentle or comforting. It carried the weight of divine judgment, the authority of heaven's messenger delivering a verdict that could not be appealed or softened. "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times?" The question focused on what Balaam had done to the animal, the violence he had inflicted on the creature that had been trying to protect him. 3 times the donkey had seen the angel and turned aside. 3 times Balaam had struck the animal in anger. 3 times his supposed wisdom had proven inferior to the donkey's simple ability to see what was actually in front of them. The angel continued, "I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me." This was the crucial statement, the revelation that explained everything. God had given Balaam permission to go, but that permission did not mean approval. It did not mean blessing. It meant that God was allowing Balaam to proceed so that Balaam could learn through experience what he had refused to understand through instruction. Your path is reckless, not forbidden. God had said Balaam could go, but reckless, dangerous, leading toward disaster, motivated by the wrong things, compromised by desire for wealth and honor and recognition. Permission had been granted, but that did not make the journey wise or righteous or safe. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared the animal. The angel made the situation absolutely clear. Balaam had been moments from death. Not once, but 3 times. Each time he urged the donkey forward, each time he struck the animal in frustration, he was pushing toward his own destruction. The sword would have fallen. Balaam would have died on this road, killed by the very God he claimed to serve, struck down while travelling to an assignment he thought he had divine permission to accept. And the donkey, the supposedly foolish animal that Balaam had beaten in anger, would have been spared. The beast had more wisdom than the prophet. The creature without speech had seen more clearly than the seer, whose words could alter the fate of nations. The humble donkey had proven more obedient to divine will than the man who made his living communicating with God. The words settled over Balaam like a crushing weight. Everything he had been certain about was revealed as illusion. The clear path forward he had been so confident about was actually leading directly to his death. The divine approval he thought he had received was not what he had believed it to be. His donkey, the beast he had considered stupid and stubborn and worthy of death, had saved his life through its disobedience. Balaam remained on the ground, his face pressed to the earth, his entire worldview shattered. The great prophet had been blind. The renowned seer had failed to see. The man whom kings sought for spiritual guidance had needed a donkey to teach him about obedience and wisdom and recognizing divine presence. Chapter 9. The message clarified. "I have sinned," Balaam said, his voice muffled by the ground, his words carrying the weight of genuine recognition. "I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me." It was the first moment of real humility in the entire journey. Not the careful acknowledgement of God's authority that he had offered to the messengers from Balak. Not the pious words about obeying. The Lord's commands that he had spoken while asking God a second time for permission he had already been denied. But actual genuine recognition of his own blindness, his own foolishness, his own desperate need for grace and mercy. He admitted that he did not realize the angel was there. He confessed that he had been blind to spiritual reality. He acknowledged that his entire perception of the situation had been wrong. This was not the statement of someone making excuses or trying to minimize their failure. This was naked honesty about complete and total blindness to what mattered most. "Now, if you are displeased," Balaam continued, "I will go back." He offered to turn around, to abandon the journey, to return home and tell the princes of Moab that he would not be completing the trip. He placed himself completely at the angel's mercy, submitting to whatever verdict would be pronounced. The angel did not tell Balaam to turn back. Instead, the divine messenger clarified what had been unclear, made explicit what Balaam should have understood from the beginning, but had failed to grasp in his desire to pursue both divine approval and earthly reward. "Go with the men," the angel said, "but speak only what I tell you." It was the same instruction God had already given when Balaam asked the second time for permission. The same condition that had been attached to the permission to travel. But now, after nearly dying, after being saved by his own donkey, after having his eyes open to see the spiritual reality he had been blind to, perhaps Balaam would hear it differently. Perhaps now he would understand that this was not a simple business transaction. This was not Balaam being hired to do a job, with freedom to navigate the details as he saw fit while technically maintaining loyalty to God. This was a test of whether Balaam would serve God's purposes or his own interests, whether he would speak truth or what he was being paid to say, whether he would prioritize divine will or human approval. The path forward was not reckless because God had forbidden him to go. The first time, God had indeed said no, and Balaam had correctly refused. But the second time, when Balaam asked again, God had given permission. The recklessness was not in going, but in why he was going, in what he hoped to accomplish, in what he was willing to compromise to achieve his goals. Balaam had convinced himself that he could manage both his faithfulness to God and his desire for the rewards Balak offered. He thought he could walk this path carefully enough to satisfy both heaven and earth, to maintain his integrity while also gaining wealth and influence and prestige. He believed his skill as a prophet, his experience in navigating spiritual matters, his track record of successfully balancing divine authority with practical concerns would allow him to handle this situation without compromising what mattered most. But God requires undivided loyalty. God demands that when we speak in the divine name, we speak only divine words, not our own preferences decorated with religious language. God insists that we choose between serving heavenly purposes and earthly ambitions, because attempting to serve both inevitably leads to serving ourselves while claiming to serve God. The angel's message was clear. Permission had been granted, but the condition remained absolute. Speak only what I tell you, not what Balak wants to hear, not what will maximize your reward, not what will preserve your reputation or enhance your influence. only what God commands, regardless of the cost, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how it affects your relationship with those who have hired you. Balaam rose from the ground slowly, carefully, still aware of how close he had come to death. He could see the angel now, could perceive the spiritual reality that had been invisible to him moments before. The sword was still drawn. The divine messenger still stood in the path. But the immediate threat had passed, replaced by a clear understanding of what was required. He remounted his donkey, the animal that had proven wiser than its master. He looked at the creature differently now, with a mixture of shame and gratitude. This beast, which he had beaten 3 times in anger, had saved his life through its stubborn refusal to obey. The donkey had seen spiritual truth with more clarity than the renowned prophet. The animal had demonstrated more faithfulness to divine will than the man who made his living speaking divine words. Balaam gathered the reins, but this time with different hands. Not the hands of someone confident in their own wisdom and authority, but the hands of someone who had been taught humility through the most unlikely teacher imaginable. The journey continued, but everything had changed. Or at least, one hopes, everything had changed. The question remained whether Balaam had truly learned the lesson, whether the experience had penetrated deeply, enough to transform not just his understanding but his heart. The princes of Moab who had witnessed all of this must have been confused and perhaps frightened. What had they just seen? Their hired prophet arguing with his donkey, then prostrating himself before something they could not see, then rising with the look of a man who had come face to face with death and barely survived. But they said nothing. They simply followed as Balaam and his donkey continued toward Moab, toward the confrontation with King Balak, toward the moment when it would become clear whether Balaam would actually keep his promise to speak only what God commanded. Chapter 10. Blessing instead of curse. When Balaam finally arrived in Moab several days later, King Balak came out to meet him with undisguised impatience and barely concealed frustration. The king had been waiting, pacing his palace, sending scouts to watch for the prophet's approach, growing more anxious with each passing day. "Did I not send you an urgent summons?" Balak demanded, his voice tight with accusation. "Why didn't you come to me immediately? Am I really not able to reward you?" The words revealed everything about how Balak viewed this arrangement. Balaam was a tool to be purchased, a service provider who should have been eager to accept such a lucrative contract. The reward offered should have been sufficient motivation to drop everything and come running. The delay between the first delegation and Balaam's eventual arrival was inexplicable and insulting. In Balak's world, everything had a price, and everyone could be bought if the offer was high enough. He had sent not 1 but 2 delegations. He had escalated the promises from substantial to extravagant. He had demonstrated his desperation and his willingness to pay whatever was necessary. Balaam's delay seemed like manipulation, like a negotiating tactic designed to drive up the price even further. Balaam responded carefully, his recent encounter with the angel still fresh in his mind. "I have come to you now, but I can only speak what God puts in my mouth." The words were simple and direct. They established the boundary that would govern everything that followed. Balaam was here. He had made the journey despite the divine opposition he had encountered. But he would not and could not speak whatever Balak wanted to hear. He was bound by a higher authority than any earthly king, answerable to a power that transcended political expedience or financial consideration. Balak seemed satisfied with this answer, perhaps interpreting it as nothing more than appropriate religious piety, the kind of spiritual language that prophets typically used while still delivering the services their clients requested. He led Balaam to a nearby town where they could see the Israelite camp in the distance. They went together to a high place, a location specifically chosen to provide a good vantage point for viewing part of the Israelite encampment spread out below. From this elevated position, Balaam could see the tents stretching across the valley, the cooking fires sending up thin columns of smoke, the people moving about their daily business, completely unaware that a prophet stood above them preparing to pronounce curse or blessing over their heads. Balak arranged for sacrifices to be offered, following the religious protocols that were supposed to accompany prophetic pronouncements. 7 altars were built. 7 bulls and 7 rams were sacrificed. The blood poured out and the meat burned as offerings to whatever gods might be listening. Everything was done properly, according to the traditions that governed such rituals. The preparations were complete. The moment had arrived. Balak stood beside the altars, surrounded by his princes and officials, waiting for Balaam to pronounce the curse that would save Moab from the advancing Israelites. Balaam stood silently for a moment, seeking the words he was supposed to speak, and then he opened his mouth, and what came out was not curse but blessing. The words flowed from him with power and authority, declarations of divine favour that could not be mistaken for anything else. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? He spoke of Israel's distinctiveness, their separation from other nations, their identity as a people set apart by divine choice. He described their numbers, comparing them to the dust of the earth, declaring their multiplication and increase. He pronounced them blessed, righteous, favoured by the very God who had sent Balaam to this high place. The blessing continued, building in intensity and clarity. These were not tentative words or carefully hedged statements that could be interpreted in multiple ways. This was straightforward, powerful declaration of Israel's protected status and promised future. Balak was furious. His face flushed with anger. His voice rose in indignation. "What have you done?" "To me, I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them." The accusation was direct and reasonable from Balak's perspective. He had sent 2 delegations. He had offered substantial rewards. He had made clear what he wanted and needed. And now, after all that effort and expense, Balaam had done exactly the opposite of what he had been hired to do. But Balaam could only respond with the truth he had learned on the road, the lesson that had been beaten into him through his donkey's stubborn refusal to carry him to his death. Must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth? It was not an apology. It was not an expression of regret or an attempt to explain why he had failed to deliver what was requested. It was simply a statement of fact. He had promised to speak only what God commanded. God had commanded blessing. Therefore, he blessed. The matter was that simple and that final. But Balak was not ready to give up. Perhaps this location was the problem. Perhaps, from a different vantage point, with a different view of the Israelite camp, the result would be different. Perhaps if they tried again with fresh sacrifices and renewed ritual, Balaam would be able to pronounce the curse that Moab so desperately needed. He took Balaam to another location, a place called the top of Pisgah, where the view was different and perhaps more conducive to cursing. Once again, 7 altars were built. Once again, 7 bulls and 7 rams were sacrificed. Once again, everything was prepared according to proper ritual protocols. And once again, when Balaam opened his mouth, blessing came out instead of curse. This time the words were even more powerful. Balaam declared that God is not human, that God does not lie or change the divine mind the way humans do. He spoke of God's command to bless Israel, of the impossibility of revoking what God had declared. He described the Lord's presence with Israel, the divine power that dwelt among them, the protection they enjoyed because God had brought them out of Egypt. He proclaimed that no curse could be effective against Israel, that no divination or sorcery could work against them, because God had blessed them. He compared them to a lioness rising up, to a lion that does not rest until it devours its prey. The imagery was powerful and unmistakable. Israel was strong, protected, destined for victory over its enemies. Balak's frustration reached new heights. "If you won't curse them, at least don't bless them," he shouted, his desperation now mixed with fury at this prophet, who seemed determined to do exactly the opposite of what he'd been brought to do. But once again, Balaam could only respond with the truth. "Did I not tell you that I must speak whatever the Lord says?" This happened not twice, but 3 times. Balak took Balaam to yet another location, the top of Mount Peor, overlooking a different part of the Israelite camp. Perhaps from here, with a fresh start and renewed determination, the result would be different. 7 more altars, 7 more bulls, 7 more rams. The same ritual repeated for the 3rd time, each repetition demonstrating Balak's desperate hope that persistence would eventually produce the desired result. And for the 3rd time, Balaam opened his mouth and blessed Israel. This final blessing was the most elaborate and beautiful of all. Balaam spoke as one in a trance, as someone seeing visions from God. He described the beauty of Israel's camp, their tents spreading out like gardens beside rivers, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside streams of water. He proclaimed their prosperity, their military might, their triumph over enemies. He declared that those who blessed Israel would be blessed, and those who cursed Israel would be cursed. The very thing Balak had brought Balaam to do, to curse Israel, would result in Balak himself being cursed instead. Finally, Balak's patience broke completely. His anger erupted in full force. He struck, his hands together in frustration and rage. "I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times. Now leave at once. Go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded." The accusation was clear. Balaam had failed to deliver, and therefore he would receive nothing for his journey. All the promises of wealth and honour and influence evaporated in the heat of Balak's fury. The prophet was being sent away empty-handed, dismissed in disgrace, denied the rewards that had seemed so certain when the journey began. But Balaam had one final message to deliver, one last prophecy that needed to be spoken, even though no one had requested it, and no payment would be forthcoming. He spoke of Israel's future king, of a ruler who would rise from Jacob, of a scepter that would emerge from Israel and crush the foreheads of Moab's people. He prophesied the destruction of Moab's enemies, the establishment of Israel's dominance, the fulfillment of divine promises made centuries earlier to their ancestor Abraham. And then, having spoken everything God had given him to say, Balaam prepared to return home. He had travelled to Moab at great expense and with substantial risk. He had encountered an angel sent to kill him on the road. He had been saved by his donkey's wisdom when his own spiritual sight had failed completely. He had arrived in Moab and blessed Israel 3 times despite being hired to curse them. And now he would leave with nothing to show for it except the knowledge that he had, finally, spoken only what God commanded. The blessing stood, spoken and unretractable. Every word that had come from Balaam's mouth had been exactly what Balak did not want to hear, and exactly what God had determined should be spoken. Israel was blessed. The words could not be taken back. The pronouncements could not be undone. And Moab would have to face the approaching nation without the spiritual weapon they had hoped to deploy against them. Epilogue. When God uses the unlikely. The story of Balaam and his donkey stands as one of the strangest and most profound narratives in all of Scripture. It is a story that makes us uncomfortable, that challenges our assumptions about wisdom and foolishness, about who God chooses to speak through and why. It refuses to fit into neat categories or simple moral frameworks. It presents us with a prophet who is both faithful and faithless, obedient and rebellious, spiritually gifted and spiritually blind. God used a donkey to save a prophet. Let that sink in for a moment. Not another prophet. Not an angel appearing in visible form from the beginning. Not a dramatic vision or an audible voice from heaven. A donkey, an animal considered among the least intelligent of domesticated creatures. A beast of burden valued only for its ability to carry loads and transport humans from one place to another. This donkey, which could not read scripture or quote theology or make sophisticated arguments about divine will, possessed spiritual sight that the renowned prophet lacked. This humble animal, which had no training in prophetic arts and no reputation for wisdom, demonstrated more faithfulness to divine purposes than the man who made his living communicating with God. Think about what this means for our assumptions about spiritual authority and religious expertise. We tend to believe that education matters, that training is essential, that proper credentials and recognized authority are necessary for someone to be trusted as a spiritual guide. We assume that those who have devoted their lives to religious study, who have demonstrated prophetic gifts, who have track records of successfully hearing from God, are the ones we should listen to when spiritual matters are at stake, and then God uses a donkey to teach a prophet about obedience. This is not a story that flatters human pride. It does not suggest that education, reputation, spiritual gifts, or Religious authority automatically grants us clarity about truth. In fact, it suggests precisely the opposite. It demonstrates that all our certainty, all our confidence in our own spiritual perception, all our accumulated wisdom and experience can become the very thing that blinds us to what God is actually doing right in front of us. Balaam was not an evil man, at least not in any simple or straightforward way. He was not deliberately rebelling against God with full knowledge that he was doing wrong. He sought divine guidance before making decisions. He refused the first delegation because God told him not to go. He made a point of saying repeatedly that he could only speak what God put in his mouth. By all external measures, he was behaving like a faithful prophet should behave. But somewhere in his heart, in the place where intentions form and desires take shape, Balaam had developed a divided loyalty. He wanted to serve God, but he also wanted the wealth and prestige that Balak was offering. He wanted to maintain his reputation as someone who heard from God, but he also wanted to be seen as powerful and valuable by earthly kings. He wanted to speak divine truth, but he also wanted to be rewarded handsomely for his services, and he convinced himself that it was possible to have both, that he could navigate this situation skillfully enough to satisfy both heaven and earth, that his spiritual gifts and experience would allow him to walk this narrow path without falling off either side. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of spiritual blindness, the belief that we can serve two masters if we are just clever enough or careful enough or spiritually mature enough to balance their competing demands. Jesus would later say explicitly that this is impossible, that no one can serve both God and money, that attempting to do so inevitably leads to loving one and hating the other. But Balaam lived before that teaching was made explicit, and he thought he could manage what was actually impossible. His desire for recognition, his attraction to wealth, his sense of his own importance and capability created a blindness more complete than any physical impairment could cause. He could not see the angel standing in his path because he did not want to see. His internal certainty that he was handling the situation properly, that he had received divine permission, and therefore could proceed with confidence, blocked his ability to perceive spiritual reality. He convinced himself that going to Moab was acceptable because God had given permission when he asked the second time. He persuaded himself that he could take Balak's money while still maintaining integrity by only speaking what God commanded. He thought he understood the situation fully and could navigate it successfully. And he was completely, dangerously wrong. It took a donkey seeing an angel to penetrate his blindness. It took the humiliation of being contradicted by his own beast of burden to break through his certainty. It took the experience of nearly being killed by the very God he claimed to serve before Balaam could see truth clearly. The donkey had no theology degree. The donkey had never studied the prophetic traditions or learned the proper protocols for seeking divine guidance. The donkey had no reputation to protect and no desire for wealth or prestige. The donkey simply saw what was directly in front of it and refused to walk into obvious danger. And that simple, immediate response to present reality proved more spiritually valuable than all of Balaam's accumulated wisdom and prophetic experience. Consider what the donkey teaches us about genuine faithfulness. The animal did not need to understand why the angel was there or what larger spiritual dynamics were at play. It did not need to comprehend the political implications of Balaam's journey, or the theological questions raised by God giving permission for something God opposed. The donkey just needed to see the angel with the drawn sword and recognize that forward movement meant death. This is basic, fundamental faithfulness, seeing what is actually there and responding appropriately, without needing to fit the experience into a pre-existing framework, or interpret it through the lens of what we want or expect or believe should be true. Balaam could not do this. His prophetic training, his spiritual gifts, his confidence in his own ability to discern divine will actually made him less capable of seeing truth than his donkey was. He had theories and frameworks, an understanding that he tried to fit reality into. The donkey had none of that. It just had eyes that could see an angel and instincts that recognized danger. The lesson here is not primarily about donkeys or angels or ancient prophets. The lesson is about us, about the human capacity for self-deception, about how easily we can mistake our own desires for divine leading, about the danger of becoming so confident in our spiritual perception that we stop being willing to be corrected. How often do we pray for guidance but secretly hope God will confirm what we already want to do? How often do we claim to be seeking God's will while actually just looking for divine permission to pursue our own plans? How often do we trust our own spiritual judgment to the point where we dismiss or ignore signs that we might be heading in the wrong direction? How often do we, like Balaam, ask God the same question twice when we do not like the first answer, hoping that changed circumstances or different wording will produce the permission we are seeking? Balaam's donkey teaches us that wisdom is not tied to status or education or spiritual giftedness. That truth can come from unexpected sources, from places we would never think to look, from voices we might be inclined to dismiss as unqualified or unimportant. That God will use whatever means necessary to get our attention when we are walking toward danger while convinced we are following the divine path. The donkey could not argue theology or quote scripture, or make sophisticated arguments about proper interpretation of divine commands. It could only see what was directly in front of it and refuse to walk into obvious danger. And that simple form of faithfulness turned out to be exactly what was needed. Sometimes, perhaps more often than we would like to admit, the simplest form of faithfulness is exactly what we need. Not complex theological reasoning, not careful analysis of competing interpretations, not sophisticated spiritual discernment that weighs various factors and comes to nuanced conclusions. Just the basic ability to see what is actually in front of us and respond appropriately. Seeing truth requires humility. It requires the willingness to admit we might be wrong, even when we are certain we are right. Especially when we are certain we are right. It requires us to pay attention when circumstances tell us something different than what we expected. It requires us to consider that maybe, just maybe, we are not seeing the full picture, that our understanding is incomplete, that our certainty is misplaced. It requires us to be willing to learn from sources we might initially dismiss as inferior or unqualified, to recognize that someone with less education might see things we miss, that someone with less experience might have clearer perception precisely because they are not viewing everything through the lens of accumulated assumptions and established frameworks. It requires us to value truth over our own ego, to prioritize accurate perception over maintaining our reputation for wisdom, to care more about actually understanding reality than about appearing to understand reality. God often speaks through what we overlook, through the people we consider unimportant or unsophisticated, through the voices we dismiss as lacking proper authority or credentials, through the circumstances we find frustrating and inconvenient because they do not fit our plans, through the obstacles that seem to be blocking our path but might actually be protecting us from walking into disaster. The question is whether we are willing to listen, whether we can cultivate the kind of humility that allows us to hear truth regardless of its source, whether we can recognize divine guidance even when it arrives through channels we never expected and would not have chosen. Balaam's story does not end cleanly or simply. Even after his encounter with the angel, even after blessing Israel 3 times as God commanded, his relationship with God remained complicated. Later biblical texts suggest that Balaam eventually did find ways to harm Israel, that his desire for reward ultimately led him to give Balak advice that led to Israel's sin and punishment. The experience on the road changed him, but perhaps not as completely or permanently as it should have. This is sobering and realistic. Dramatic spiritual experiences do not always produce lasting transformation. Having our eyes opened does not guarantee that we will keep them open. Learning humility through humiliation does not mean we will remain humble once the immediate crisis has passed. But the story itself endures, preserved in Scripture as a testimony to what happens when spiritual pride meets divine opposition. It stands as a warning to all who claim to speak for God. Check your motivations, examine your heart, remain humble enough to be corrected, and never become so confident in your own spiritual perception that you cannot learn from a donkey. God speaks through what we overlook, and God is listening for whether we are willing to hear. As you settle into rest tonight, perhaps let this story work on your heart the way these ancient stories are meant to work. Not as entertainment, not as mere history, but as a mirror held up to show us ourselves, not as a quaint tale about a talking animal, but as a profound meditation on the nature of spiritual blindness and the unexpected ways God breaks through our certainty to teach us truth. Where are the places in your own life where certainty might be creating blindness? Where have you become so confident in your understanding that you have stopped being willing to question your assumptions or consider that you might be wrong? Where are the voices you are dismissing, the warnings you are ignoring, the signs you are refusing to see because they do not fit your expectations or support your plans? Where are the donkeys in your life, the unlikely sources of wisdom that might be trying to save you from walking into disaster? The people whose counsel you dismiss because they lack proper credentials? The circumstances that frustrate you because they seem to be blocking your path? The obstacles that make you angry because they prevent you from reaching goals you have set? What if those obstacles are angels with drawn swords? What if those frustrations are divine interventions? What if those voices you are dismissing are actually seeing spiritual reality more clearly than you can see it with all your accumulated wisdom and experience? Where are the opportunities to practice humility before humiliation is forced upon you? Where can you choose to examine your heart, question your motivations, consider that your desire for certain outcomes might be blinding you to truth you need to see? These are not comfortable questions. They require a level of honest self-examination that most of us resist most of the time. It is far easier to remain confident in our own judgment, to trust our own spiritual perception, to proceed with certainty even when signs suggest we might be heading in the wrong direction. But Balaam's story suggests that maintaining that certainty might cost us more than we are willing to pay, that spiritual blindness can be deadly, that refusing to listen to unlikely messengers can lead us directly into the path of divine judgment, and it also suggests that God is merciful, patient, willing to intervene repeatedly to protect us from our own foolishness. The angel appeared 3 times. The donkey turned aside 3 times. Balaam was given multiple opportunities to recognize what was happening before the final confrontation forced him to see. God did not simply strike Balaam dead on the road. God sent an angel. God gave the donkey speech. God opened Balaam's eyes. God worked to save the prophet even from himself, even when Balaam was actively pursuing a course that would lead to destruction. This is worth remembering when we are tempted to despair about our own blindness or foolishness. God is not waiting eagerly to punish us for our failures of perception. God is working to open our eyes, sending messengers we might not recognize, creating obstacles that feel frustrating but are actually protective, speaking through voices we might initially dismiss. The question is whether we will have ears to hear and eyes to see, whether we will remain humble, enough to learn from sources we would not have chosen, whether we will value truth more than our own pride, whether we will choose faithfulness over reputation, obedience over reward, divine approval over human recognition. God speaks through what we overlook, through donkeys and children and unlikely prophets, through circumstances that seem random and people who appear unqualified, through the small and the weak and the overlooked, precisely because using such means demonstrates that the power and wisdom come from God and not from impressive human sources. And God is listening for whether we are willing to hear, not just willing to hear when the message confirms what we already believe, not just willing to hear when it comes through channels we consider legitimate and authoritative, but willing to hear even when the truth arrives through a source that seems impossible, that challenges our pride, that requires us to admit we have been blind. Balaam eventually spoke the blessings God required him to speak. But he did so only after being humbled completely, only after being shown how little he actually understood, only after his donkey proved wiser than he was. His story is preserved not as an example to emulate, but as a warning about the dangers of divided loyalty and spiritual pride. May we learn from his mistakes without having to repeat them. May we cultivate the kind of humility that allows us to see clearly before we walk into danger. May we value wisdom wherever it comes from, rather than dismissing truth because it arrives through unexpected channels. May we remember that sometimes the donkey sees what the prophet cannot, and may that memory keep us humble, attentive, and willing to be taught by the most unlikely teachers. Rest now in that truth. Let it settle into your heart as you drift towards sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to choose between certainty and humility, between maintaining our pride and embracing truth, even when it comes from sources we would not have chosen. The road ahead is not always what it seems. Angels stand in paths we cannot see. Donkeys sometimes speak truths that prophets miss. And God works through what we overlook to accomplish purposes we cannot imagine. Walk carefully, listen widely, remain humble, and remember that the measure of wisdom is not how much we know, but how willing we are to admit what we do not know. The greatest spiritual gift is not the ability to prophesy or work miracles or speak with authority. It is simply the willingness to see what is actually there, rather than what we expect or want or believe should be there. May you sleep well, with eyes open to truth from whatever source it comes, and may you wake with the wisdom to recognize divine guidance, even when it arrives through means you never anticipated. The donkey saw the angel, the prophet did not, and that simple fact contains more wisdom than libraries full of theological treatises. Learn from it, remember it. Let it shape how you walk through the world, and may you never become so certain of your own spiritual perception that you cannot learn from the humblest teacher. Rest now. Peace be with you.